All right, good morning, everyone. It's now 11 o'clock, and welcome to the Whatcom Watershed Information Network and Whatcom County Marine Resources Committee Speaker Series event on drought contingency planning and preparedness. WWIN is a non-advocacy apolitical network of diverse interests supporting community engagement in natural resource topics. The Whatcom MRC is part of the Federal Northwest Straits Marine Conservation Initiative and works to protect and enhance the marine environment. In addition to WWIN and the Whatcom MRC, this event was also put on with support from the Northwest Straits Initiative, Washington State University Extension, Whatcom County, Resources, Public Utility District Number 1 of Whatcom County, and the Water Resource Inventory Area 1 Watershed Management Board. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the planning team, which includes myself, Carly Deathridge, Austin Rose, Rebecca Schlotterback, Cheryl Lovato-Niles, and Becky Peterson. We've been looking forward to this event for quite some time and are thrilled to see so many participants on the webinar. I will be your moderator for today's event, and a little bit about me. I'm a lifelong resident of the Puget Sound region, graduate of Western Washington University, an avid hiker and novice gardener. But in my professional life, I'm the Land and Water Policy Manager at Resources, which is a nonprofit based in Bellingham, Washington. Resources works to mobilize people to protect the water, land, and climate we all depend on in Northwest Washington State. So I want to let everybody know that this webinar is being recorded. The recording of today's webinar will be posted on WWIN.org, which is the Whatcom Watershed Information Network's website, sometime in the next day or so. We'll also send out a follow-up email about that to all the registrants. Additionally, there's some ground rules for today's webinar. All participant cameras and microphones are muted for this event. There will be opportunities to ask questions verbally by raising your hand after each speaker talk or during the designated question and answer periods. You may also ask questions by using the chat feature. However, those questions won't be answered until the Q&A segment. Given the short time that will be available for questions, please try to be concise and specific with your question. And then there's some other details that we want to make note of. So as you logged in, you might be logged in under someone else's name, such as Cheryl Niles. You have the ability to change your name to your actual name through the participants feature, or the little ellipses around your avatar if you're in gallery view at the moment. So I just want to make that clear. And now we will move on. So now to the more interesting parts of today's event. WWIN received a lot of interest earlier this year from members of the public in hosting an event on climate and drought. This was all timely given that the Public Utility District of Whatcom County finalized a drought contingency plan for the Nooksack watershed last year, and we're looking for opportunities to inform the community about the plan. In addition to learning about drought planning and preparedness efforts at the federal, state, and local levels, the goal of this forum is to provide an opportunity to hear from various points of view from the different sectors in Whatcom County. This morning's session is more of a big picture of climate impacts on water supply and stream flow, as well as drought planning and preparedness. And we'll take a break at 12:30 for lunch and get back to it at 1 o'clock. The afternoon session will focus more on the local drought planning effort and how specific sectors like agriculture, fisheries, and public water systems in Whatcom County would be impacted by a drought and what can be done to reduce those impacts. Now we'll transition to our first speaker of today, and that is Crystal Raymond. So Crystal Raymond is a climate adaptation specialist with the Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington. She has worked on climate adaptation for over 10 years as both a researcher and practitioner. In her previous position, she was a climate adaptation specialist for the U.S. Forest Service in Seattle City Light. She works on climate adaptation and resilience as it relates to wildfires, forests, and water resources of the Pacific Northwest. She has a PhD in forest ecology and from the University of Washington. So, Crystal, I will turn it over to you to start your presentation. And I think you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, you can hear me, and are you able to see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay.
Oh, I think it's working.
There we go. You're able to see my presentation?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to present, and I'm excited to kick off this event with a nice overview of climate change impacts to this region and what we can expect for drought. I will start by summarizing quickly some of the observations and the ways in which we are seeing the climate change. And let's see, I'll just been asked to start my video, so I'll do that as well. Okay, great. So as I said, I'll start by talking about some of the observations and the ways in which we are seeing the climate change. And then I will shift gears a little bit and look ahead, looking at some climate projections and what we can expect for changes in the climate and drought in the future. So how has our climate already changed? I want to start with some examples. So one of the most obvious is that the climate has gotten warmer throughout the Pacific Northwest. A good way to think about this is that the average year in the Northwest is about 1.5 degrees warmer than it was during the first half of the 20th century. So we've seen warming in all seasons. And if you look at that average annual temperature, we see that that has warmed consistently since the beginning of the century. Oftentimes, we don't really think about the average annual temperature. That doesn't necessarily have a lot of meaning, or that we don't necessarily make plans based around something like the average annual temperature. So I think it can be really important to think about some of the extremes or the seasonal changes. And so here's an example of that. The coldest day of the year in wintertime has warmed about 5 degrees Fahrenheit since the beginning of the century. So really looking at that extreme cold day, we see that getting warmer. Another example of this that I like to talk about is the difference between nighttime temperatures and daytime temperatures. So we've seen the minimum temperatures on average warming more than the daytime temperatures. So one of the things that we're seeing is a shrinking of that diurnal range in our daytime temperatures. And that has a lot of implications for a number of different things around the region. Our infrastructure, the fact that we don't really have very much air conditioning is all based around on the fact that we expect it to get cool in the evenings, more so than other parts of the country. So some implications of those warming temperatures, particularly in the wintertime, is that we have seen snowpack across the Washington Cascades decrease about 25% since the middle of the century through 2006. And that has a lot of implications for stream flow as well. So in a number of locations around the region, we're seeing changes in stream flow, particularly in the timing of stream flow. So for example, when we think about that snow melt peak in stream flow that we have in a lot of higher elevation watersheds around the state, we see that that timing of spring runoff has shifted about 20 days earlier in the later part of the century. So that was a quick summary of some of the changes that we're witnessing. And now I want to shift gears and talk about what we expect for the future. And this is based on climate modeling. So these are projections. We call them projections specifically rather than predictions or forecasts, because we're talking about the average changes in the future. We're not talking about a forecasted or predicted change for any one year or any particular season. Climate modeling is really about looking at the averages and the trends over time. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I'll summarize quickly and give you the high level examples of what changes I'm going to be talking about. And then I'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these. So the main changes that we expect with climate change, and many of you may be familiar with this, we expect to see warming. This will be warming across all seasons. And as a result of the warming, just as we have already seen in the 20th century, we expect to see warming result in less snow in the wintertime and earlier snow melt. So I want to emphasize that that less snow is not necessarily because of a change in precipitation. We may actually see more precipitation in the wintertime. That lower snowpack really comes from warming temperatures in the winter that cause more winter precipitation to fall as rain rather than snow, and therefore it melts off earlier in the season. And that leads to my third major change that I want to highlight, and that shifts in our stream flow. And again, the shifting stream flow towards having higher high flows, lower low flows is really a result of that warming trend that we see change the form of the precipitation that we get, not necessarily because of precipitation changes themselves. And then I have over here on the right, showing an icon here to mention natural variability. So I want to highlight that natural variability doesn't go away. And anybody here who works with water resources or natural resources knows, in fact, that we have a huge amount of natural variability from one year to the next. And even with the warming trend with climate change, we do not expect to see that natural variability go away. We will still have years with higher than average snowpack. We will still have colder than average years. But in general, we're talking about a warming trend. So now I want to go into a little bit more detail about what those projections will be. These are examples of changes in some of the trends, focusing specifically on this region around Whatcom County. This is actually the Nooksack watershed that's highlighted in these maps. And so some of the people from the Nooksack tribe may be familiar with these figures. These are some that were developed for an analysis of the Nooksack watershed. And I will show a couple of similar graphics. And so I want to just orient you to these. So what you see
Crystal, sorry to interrupt, but you've muted yourself.
Oh,
there you go.
Okay. Hopefully I wasn't muted for too long. I don't know how that happened. Okay. So I was just showing, this is an example of some of the ways that I'll show projected changes. And so I want to orient you to these figures. These show the Nooksack watershed in particular. You have on the left the historical. This is looking at average summer temperature. The historical is the 1970 to 1999 average, and that looks as you would expect, with warmer temperatures at lower elevations, colder temperatures at higher elevations. And then what we have on the four figures on the right is the change in that temperature moving forward in time. We're looking at the 2050s and the 2080s, so moving further out in time. And then the RCPs are two different scenarios of what climate change might be like in the future. The main thing that you need to know for these is that the RCP 4.5 is a fairly low greenhouse gas emission scenario, so a fairly low warming scenario, whereas the RCP 8.5 is a high warming scenario. And so what you see here is for the 2050s, we're looking at about 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer. And as we move to the 2080s, about 4 to 6 degrees Celsius warmer. And next I want to show average winter precipitation. So these figures are laid out in the same way. And here we're looking at change in the average winter precipitation, which is pretty similar, about 2 to 3 degrees warmer by the 2050s, but a little bit less warming in winter. And so as I mentioned in the summary, the biggest impact of that warming is changes in snowpack. And so here we're looking at April 1st snow water equivalent across the area. And we see pretty large decreases in snowpack across the region. About 100% decrease in the April 1st snowpack at lower elevations, and smaller decreases as we move up in elevation. And I just want to emphasize that this does not mean a complete loss in the snowpack. It just means for this April 1 time period that we look at, we're talking about having no snow left then in the April 1 timeframe, but that snowpack shifting earlier into the season. And so this has pretty big implications for runoff. So here we're looking at the Nooksack River, and we see this is the 2020s, the average stream flow per month. And the biggest changes that we see, and I'll scroll through time here, are increases in the winter flows, basically from more winter rain and more runoff during the winter time, and much lower summer stream flows because that snowpack melts earlier. And we have a shift in the timing of that stream flow. And here's moving into the 2080s, where we just see an accentuation of that same pattern. And the black line on this figure shows you the historical, and you see that there's maybe a small amount of a runoff from snow happening around April, May, and we really lose that spring snowpack runoff, and it's shifting into the winter. And so this is a summary of that runoff. So here we're looking at total runoff, surface and shallow groundwater runoff through the April to September timeframe. And you can see that throughout much of the region, there's a fairly big, up to a 50% decline in the runoff during the warm season, because that runoff has happened during the colder months. So I want to just kind of summarize what this means for drought. There was a great paper that came out from Karen Bumbacco in the Washington State Climatologist Office and Phil Mote. They called it the 3 flavors of drought for the Northwest. It always makes me think of ice cream when I think about the flavors of drought. So I have this ice cream cone example here, and I just want to mention the 3 different types of drought that we can get in the Northwest and what climate change might mean for those. So one of them is really low winter precipitation, or low overall annual precipitation. The second being low summer precipitation, or dry summers, warm temperatures in the summertime. And the third is the warm winters, or what we would call a snowpack drought. And the warm winters, low snowpack is really the type of drought that we experienced in this region in 2005, and also much more recently in 2015, the drought that a lot of us experienced and dealt with a number of impacts associated with. So I think the basic point that I want to make here is that those number 2 and 3 droughts, the lower summer precipitation, warmer summer conditions, and the snowpack droughts, are really the types of droughts that we expect to see happen more frequently with climate change, because they're really driven more by temperature. That top one, the number 1, kind of low winter precipitation or low annual precipitation, that's not necessarily the type of drought that we expect to see more often with climate change, simply because we really don't expect to see a change in total annual precipitation, or we may even see an increase in winter precipitation. So just to kind of end with a picture, because who doesn't like to think about toddlers and ice cream? I think about the toddler licking the ice cream cone, and you're always worried that that ice cream is going to fall off. So I would say that top flavor, the low winter annual precipitation, we probably won't see too much of that. Might fall off when the toddler licks the ice cream cone, but those bottom 2 droughts, we expect to see more of those and more impacts associated with those. And you know, what we saw from similar droughts, the low summer precipitation one, that can really affect forest ecosystems, in-stream flows in the summertime. We tend to have forest fires. And that number 3 one, warmer winters, low snowpack, that affects a lot of water resources, can really affect irrigation, hydropower, and just general demand for water resources. So those can have both significant impacts. And so I think I'm going to skip through those. I was just summarizing the types of impacts we would have, and I can end there and take any questions.
Great, thanks, Crystal. And we are welcoming questions either in the chat. Please send your questions to everyone in the drop-down list where it says to, and then you could also raise your hand and I can unmute you. So we'll maybe give it a minute or two. We have until 11:25 for questions.
I'm not sure I can see the chat. So should I stop sharing in order to see questions written into the chat, or will you?
I will read
them for me?
Yeah,
Okay,
I'll read the questions that come in. So far, I haven't seen any.
All perfectly clear then. That's fantastic. And I will say that I have my email here, and I'm happy to take any follow-up questions by email as well.
Okay. We do have a question that's come in. Has there been any modeling done on the impact of the Fraser outfall that we have in Whatcom?
I'd be curious to know what that is, actually.
Got it. Can you talk more about flood impacts as it relates to peak flows and winter precipitation?
Yeah, great question. So I was focused a little more on drought since this was a drought planning meeting, but so yeah, flooding being the flip side of the drought. And so when we see really an accentuation of our seasonal water conditions, then we would expect flooding to increase in the wintertime. And so that increased frequency and volume of flooding. And again, that's related to that warming temperature trend where we would see, as more of our big storms come in the wintertime, we would expect to see them with warmer temperatures and getting bigger flood events. So much of our flooding, particularly in Western Washington, comes from those big atmospheric river or Pineapple Express events. And we expect those to come with even warmer temperatures. Another change that has been shown in the modeling that I didn't mention before was we also expect to see heavier precipitation in those events. And that's really a thermodynamic change in that with a warmer atmosphere, those really big atmospheric river events can hold more precipitation. And so in something like a 24-hour rain event, we expect to see even more precipitation that would contribute to flooding. And that's something that we really saw in 2015 as well. When the storms did come in during the winter in that year, they were with very warm temperatures and led to flooding.
All right, apologies for that. I had some technical difficulties. Let's see. We have one more minute. I don't know if there have been any other questions that came in while I was dealing with my technical difficulties.
This is Chris Elder. I'll just read off the one question that Alan Chapman submitted, which was, have there been any model projections considering kind of the Fraser River watershed on the resources in the Nooksack? I think it's similar to the Fraser outfall question.
So, yeah, I mean, I think No, so I'm not aware of any model projections on that. I think, unfortunately, one of the, I think some of the cross-border and sort of larger regional modeling to the north and our Canadian friends and kind of looking at that bigger region as a whole when we're up here at the northern part of the border, I think that's been dealt with well in the Columbia River Basin, recognizing a need to definitely have more cross-border modeling there. I'm not familiar with what's happening in terms of more the broader Fraser area and modeling there. So I wouldn't be able to answer that question either.
Thank you, Crystal, so much for your presentation on the climate overview here for Whatcom County. And with that, we will be transitioning to our next speaker on federal drought preparedness, and that is Darion Mayhorn. So as the drought coordinator, Darion Mayhorn is responsible for managing the federal drought response program. In this position, he responds to congressional inquiries, develops and maintains the multi-million-dollar annual budget, develops agency policy, and coordinates and communicates with stakeholders and internal staff to support the planning and implementation of actions that build long-term resiliency to drought across the West. Before this position, Darion served as a civil engineer with the Bureau of Reclamation's Oklahoma, Texas area office and with the Army Corps of Engineers. Darion received his bachelor's in civil engineering and applied math from St. Louis University and a master's in civil engineering from the University of Oklahoma. He is a registered professional engineer in the state of Colorado. Please take it away, Darion. And I think you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, I'll totally do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate the introduction. And let's see, can you see my screen, Carly?
Yes, that's coming up. Great.
Okay, awesome. All righty, so I'm super excited to be with you all. I feel like it's been a long time coming too for this discussion, this forum today. So I'm very happy. I'm of course disappointed that it couldn't be in person. I was hoping to finally make it to Whatcom County. I've been just south of the county line. So like I went back and did some research because I was like, I think I've been super close. One time I was visiting some friends in Seattle in 2016 and we went for a hike, Oyster Dome hike. And I guess it's just south of Whatcom County. So anyway, I've been super close to you all. But I'm hopeful that there will be an opportunity in the future to be able to make it out and meet some of you folks in person. But again, I'm super excited to be here today and to have the opportunity to speak with you all. So I won't say again much about myself. Carly did a really good job for me with that, with the bio. I forget how long that is until I hear someone else say it, then I figure I need to find a way to consolidate that. But so anyway, my goal today is to be able to talk with you all about, just federal drought preparedness. When we were talking about this and putting together what the agenda would look like, originally the thought was to kind of speak to a national drought plan. And a spoiler is that we don't have a national drought plan. It probably would be good if we did, but what I want to speak to is what Reclamation does as an agency, as it is related to not only for ourselves being better prepared for drought, but supporting our stakeholders as well. But then I also want to talk about, as a federal family, some of the coordination that we do behind the scenes that kind of in some way functions of us all kind of coordinating and being prepared, even though we don't have just one overall federal drought plan. So I always like to start first with some background for folks. So Reclamation, we're a federal water resources agency. We were established in 1902 to reclaim the arid West by bringing water and power resources. And our mission statement is that, simply put, we manage, develop, and protect water in the interest of the American public. One unique thing about Reclamation is that we are in the 17 Western states. There are a few authorities that allow us to work outside of that purview, but primarily our organization is just focused on the 17 Western states. So the Dakotas, south to Texas, and on to the west to California. So for Reclamation, just to give a little context and history for us and our drought program. So Reclamation has had the authority to kind of be better prepared, or at least even respond to drought since the early 90s. So the Reclamation States Emergency Drought Relief Act of 1991 gave us that authority. And it did kind of two different things. So Title I of that act, it says that Reclamation, you have the authority to be involved with helping to alleviate emergency drought conditions. There's a variety of different ways that we can do that. Through construction, management, and conservation activities, through water marketing, through potentially us purchasing water or storing and conveying water, even through some of our facilities, and then also in being involved in water banking or helping to coordinate water banking. So a mixture of us doing actual on the ground work and activities, and then also some technical assistance. Title II says Reclamation, you can be involved with drought planning. And then in 2000, Congress amended that act and they said, Reclamation, not only can you be involved with drought planning, but you can provide financial assistance for others to develop their own drought plans. So historically, most of our funding was used for those emergency response actions. There would be a drought declaration, and Reclamation be requested to go and help drill a well. Or a pretty good example of one that was done fairly recently is back in, I think, 2015, 2016, Kachuma Lake, which is out in Southern California. The reservoir out there had gotten so low that water was not even overlapping into the intake structure. And so Reclamation assisted in funding with basically a barge that went out on the lake with a pump that went out to the deepest part of the reservoir and pumped water into the intake structure. So these very, reactionary, very, not very well planned type projects, right? We're just reacting to whatever concerns were in front of us at that time. So in 2015, we reformulated our program to have more of a proactive approach so that we could work with our non-federal partners to prepare for and respond to drought. And I think we all can agree, right, that planning ahead is much more efficient and more effective than us taking measures in a crisis. It gives us the opportunity to just be better prepared, be more thoughtful with the type of activities that we're undertaking. And so when we reformulated the program, it was with this key objective of assisting our stakeholders and ourselves, really, and being better prepared for drought. And what does that look like? So identifying vulnerabilities and mitigation actions that allow us to reduce risk, improving coordination and cooperation among key entities, and development of procedures for monitoring, assessing, and responding to drought, and then reducing impacts of drought and conflicts between water users. One other thing that we did when we reformulated our program is we included it under what we call the Water Smart program. The Water Smart program is this effort that was started up in the early 2010s, so around 2010, 2011. It's a department-wide framework that was established to provide federal support on the efficient use of water across the department, and primarily Reclamation and the U.S. Geological Survey, so USGS, we're primarily the two agencies that implement Water Smart for the department. And it was intended to coordinate the various water conservation activities that we had across different offices in one consolidated place. And under Water Smart, we support water conservation, water management improvements to help meet competing demands. We leverage federal and non-federal funding. There's cost share requirements. We rely on collaboration with stakeholders to develop local solutions to different water supply issues. And the different projects and studies, they span anything that you can think of, whether they're focused on increasing water and energy efficiency, or they're planning for mitigating drought, or developing scientific information and tools to plan for the future. It's a pretty wide purview of what we can do. So the drought response program, as we call it now, has 3 different components: drought contingency planning, drought resiliency projects, and emergency response actions. You can see there on the figure to the left, that map, that's a image of all of the different drought plans and projects that have been selected through the program since we reformulated it in 2015. And you can see both that we've got Whatcom County there, as well as the state of Washington. We've got Jeff Marti that's following up behind me, which he'll, I think, speak to the state's drought plan that was also updated in part through Reclamation's drought program. So I just wanted to just mention with this drought planning, this is one of the ways that Reclamation sees ourselves being able to assist our stakeholders, right? To provide financial and technical assistance to develop and update these drought plans. And we've seen a variety of different plans, whether they be from, I don't know, different state agencies or more local level. We've seen plans from tribes. We've seen just a wide variety of scales and scopes of these different drought plans. So I just wanted to give a couple of different examples. So our Buckle-Simpson Aquifer, this is a drought plan that's done in South Central Oklahoma. It was led by the Chickasaw and Choctaw Nations in collaboration with a variety of smaller water providers in the area. And one of the things that we ask for in those drought plans is that they, establish a process to monitor near and long-term water availability, and to be able to speak to how we'll be able to, react based on whatever conditions it is that we're seeing. So here's just an example where for this plan, they looked across various different sectors and said, well, if we're in stage 1 alert drought versus stage 3 emergency, what are some of the different response actions that we need to undertake? Another example that's a little closer to home, Sanitary Water Control District, they developed a drought plan through our process. And one of the other things that we ask folks to do is have an assessment of the different risks to the critical resources within their planning area. And these drive the development of mitigation and response actions. And we ask that this assessment be based on a range of future conditions. So you'll see a vulnerability assessment like this where they identify sensitivity and consequences and identify their vulnerabilities. And then you can see that shift of based on future conditions, what they anticipate to happen, right? Whether those future conditions are based on population growth or climate change or whatever else it might be. The Bay Area Regional Reliability Drought Contingency Plan is clearly in the Bay Area. And here's just an example of showing where they developed mitigation actions and thoughtfully had criteria around the usefulness of those different actions, how easy it will be to implement, what barriers may exist, and just calling that out for everyone. The drought resiliency projects, this is kind of the next steps. Well, after someone's developed that drought plan, we have funding available for them to implement projects. And so some of these are on the ground construction type projects, and then others are like decision support tools and models. Applicants can request up to $1.5 million for these projects. And again, it's all a 50-50 cost share. So in my last 2 slides here, I want to talk about kind of the coordination and collaboration that we do, right? So there is no one drought agency, right, across the federal government. We all have different responsibilities. What Reclamation's role is and involvement in drought is very different than USGS, is very different than the Corps, is very different than FEMA, is very different from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so because of that, one of the things that has become super important is us having regular communication and dialogue with one another to be clear on perhaps who's doing what and how we're best leveraging each other, right? And able to tell that story of how we all work together. And NIDIS, which is right there in the middle, that's the National Integrated Drought Information System. NIDIS is housed under NOAA, and they kind of have served this role of kind of corralling the rest of the federal family as it relates to drought planning and preparedness. And NIDIS has a variety of different work groups. I serve as the chair on one of those work groups, the Planning and Preparedness work group, actually. And they also pull together us usually annually, sometimes semi-annually, to have conversations as a federal family about what we have going on and how we can best work together, right, to again, support each other. One example that I'd like to just share of that is Reclamation. Like I said, we've been providing funding for these drought contingency plans over the past, I don't know, 4 or 5 years or so now. And so we have some pretty good data around how we could do a better job of supporting our stakeholders in developing drought plans. And one of those things that we could do a better job with is access to plans and approaches and lessons learned from other people. And that also is, you know, data and technical resources and things that may currently not exist. And it gives us an opportunity through those different forums that NIDIS has developed for us to work together and say, how do we help meet some of these gaps that are currently existing? The last slide that I just wanted to share here is our data visualization tool. So Reclamation, we have funded since 2010 a variety of different projects, including these that I've talked about under the drought response program. And I encourage folks to take a look at this data visualization tool, see the variety of different projects that we funded, and just, I don't know, get a better idea of how Reclamation could help support some of the different activities in Whatcom County that you guys would like to implement. And the last slide here is just my contact information. And again, I am super appreciative of the invite to come here and chat with you all, and I look forward to any questions.
Great, thanks so much, Darion. We appreciate your presentation and perspective. Are there any questions from folks? You may type them into the chat or raise your hand with the raise your hand feature by clicking on participants, which is toward the bottom of your screen.
I've got a really good question here.
We do.
Oh, go ahead, Carla.
Oh, I was just going to read it for everybody.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Where does the Bureau of Reclamation get their authority from?
Yes, this is an excellent question. So Reclamation, we're very unique, or at least we like to think we're unique. Unlike, let's say, the Corps of Engineers that has just this very large, very broad authority that kind of underwrites everything that they do, we don't have that type of authority. Reclamation, the kind of overriding authority we have was the Reclamation Act of 1902, which is what started our organization. But it's not as wide sweeping as some of the Corps' authorities. And so usually Reclamation's authority is all like project by project authority, where especially as it relates to construction of different projects, Congress has individually given us authority to construct different projects. In the case of WaterSmart, Congress passed what's called the Secure Water Act in 2010. Or 2009, and it provides us the authority to implement financial assistance, and it says, you know, the financial assistance that we provide should meet a couple of different metrics. That's one of the larger financial assistance authorities that we had, and before then we did not really have a broad financial assistance authority like that. But so anyway, all of our authority is very piecemeal. It's very project by project. That's a very good question.
The second question we have is, what criteria carry the most weight in considering proposals for funding capital projects?
Yeah, so almost all of our projects has a criterion called project benefits, where we want to just understand for your community, what are the benefits for that project, right? We want to understand if you're going to, you know, drill some new well, what does that, you know, what does that mean, right? You're drilling this new well to provide yourself more flexibility the next time a drought comes around, and being able to use groundwater supplies perhaps instead of surface water supplies. But whatever it is, right? Speaking to whatever those benefits are, more flexibility, just improved water management, whatever it is that you'll be gaining. That's usually the highest criteria, or the most weighted, I think I should say, is what are the project benefits coming from the recipient, right? Not us comparing a project that's taking place in Whatcom County and comparing it to one in Southern California. That's not really what we're aiming to do. It's just to understand what is the project, what are going to be the benefits for your community, and how well can you articulate that?
Great. And then we'll take one more question. With the various federal agencies you mentioned in drought, can one area have more than one drought contingency plan?
Yeah, certainly. Because again, since there is no kind of federal requirements around drought contingency plans, you will likely find areas that are overlapping. There is, I guess FEMA would be the closest, right? In that they have their hazard mitigation plans, and more so, drought is becoming a component of those hazard mitigation plans. Another thing that we're seeing too, though, I guess of less overlapping plans, but more regionalization of, like I showed that example for the Bay Area Regional Reliability Plan, where that was the work of 7, 8, 9 different water management organizations coming together to say, collectively as a region, how can we be more united in our approach towards drought, right? And how we implement projects that will allow us to support one another, how we are more consistent in our terminology around drought and explaining things to our different customers. So more and more, we're seeing kind of regionalization, I think, rather than overlapping. People are seeing the need for trying to be much more consistent when they can.
Great. Well, thank you so much again, Darion, for taking the time to present with us. And yeah, we're sorry that we couldn't see you in person up in Whatcom County, but this will have to do.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. So our next speaker, I would like to introduce Jeff Marti with the Washington State Department of Ecology. Jeff is an environmental planner and the drought coordinator for ecology. Over the course of his career, he has worked in the areas of hydroelectric project permitting, administrative rulemaking, and water right permitting. As Jeff will share in his presentation, he led the recent update of the Washington State Drought Contingency Plan with the support of a federal Water Smart grant from the Bureau of Reclamation, as we had just heard. Jeff will also speak to legislation that incorporated key recommendations from the plan, which strengthens our state's drought framework. Jeff chairs the State Water Supply Availability Committee, which monitors and supplies water supply and drought, or which monitors water supplies and then drought conditions as well, and advises the state's executive water emergency committee, the body responsible for recommending declarations of drought emergencies to the governor. He has a bachelor's of science from Iowa State University and a master's of environmental studies from the Evergreen State College. So Jeff, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Hey, good morning, everyone. Is my sound quality okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So yeah, I'm the drought guy for the Department of Ecology, and thanks for the opportunity to give you an overview of the Washington State Drought Framework today. And hopefully by the end of my presentation, you'll have a good idea of how the state goes about determining whether in fact we are in a drought, expect to be in a drought, and if so, what happens when the state actually declares formal drought conditions, and what the opportunities are for you folks at the local level is to get help for your water users and uses in your local area via the state process. All right, so I do have some rather dry bureaucratic details to go through with you. And the first is that at the state level, we do have a state framework for drought. And not every state can say that. And so we have a regulation that specifies drought conditions, and we have some rules that define when drought, then those conditions are met, what are the processes and the requirements and the standards for the State Department of Ecology to follow in terms of administering drought relief, and also how we perform forecasting and monitoring. And then we also have a state drought contingency plan that goes even in more detail than our regulation. It talks more about drought metrics, forecasting limitations, response and mitigation actions, and vulnerabilities. And our drought plan was just updated in, let's see, I think we got it approved in fall of 2018. We did get a Water Smart grant for that. Thank you, Darion. And that gave us, some resources to devote some staff, get an outside consultant to help us move it along and publish that update. And that plan has also become the basis for some new legislation that we passed or got in effect this spring. It actually became effective on June 11th. And I'll be talking about the legislative changes as well later on in my presentation. So real simply, real basically, Washington State's drought trigger. How do we declare drought? Why do we declare drought? And our regulation, the legislature gave us kind of two primary considerations. One is a hydrologic consideration, a water supply consideration, and that is if an area is experiencing or is expected to experience less than 75% of normal water supply. So it's a question of the physical conditions. And then the second criteria is, well, in those areas where you expect water supply deficiency, is there a potential for hardship to water users and uses? And if you have both of those criteria are met, then the state can say that drought conditions are in effect, and it can move forward with a formal order to declare that and activate the state drought response. So I hate to do this to you as well. This is kind of a process slide, but it does take people and committees to move these decisions along. And so there are two key committees in, that are involved in this. One is the Water Supply Availability Committee that looks at that water supply side of the equation. And WASAC is mostly federal experts in meteorology and hydrology and forecasting. The other committee is the Executive Water Emergency Committee. That's state agency folks, executive level people that look at the kind of the social, economic, environmental side of the equation. Is there a potential for hardship? And so WASAC meets about every 4 to 8 weeks to look at water supply conditions statewide, snowpack, precipitation, temperature, climate outlooks. And we always have kind of a keen outlook to that magic line of 75% of normal, especially with respect to our April through September period, because that's our, typically drier season in Washington. And, we have less precipitation then, water demand goes up. That's when people are out in their yards, irrigating their crops. And so we count on snowpack, groundwater, constructed reservoirs to get us through the summer. And so we're always trying to anticipate what are those conditions going to be like this spring and summer. Now, if WASAC identifies an area, and we usually look at the watershed level, that's unlikely to stay above 75% of normal, it can recommend that EWEC convene to look at the hardship potential in those particular watersheds. And then EWEC, historically, we don't have a lot of droughts, but historically, so there's not a vast amount of experience, but historically, those discussions have been exclusively state agencies, but our authority, the authority does give us the ability to include local and tribal governments as well in the EWEC deliberations as well. And so I know that Whatcom County, I think is probably interested in that. and now you have your own drought contingency plan. And so the next time, EWEC convenes, I think it would be good if we could see if Whatcom County could join in those discussions, especially if the Nooksack watershed is one of those kind of problematic areas of concern. So this is real quickly kind of the membership of WASAC. I kind of call WASAC the geeks. I call EWEC the suits. And so the geeks, your federal scientists, the hydrologists, the meteorologists, also the Office of Washington State Climatologists. These are the people that really kind of know the relationship of climate, snowpack, and how that affects river flows and groundwater. So, and then here's the core EWEC group. Again, primarily state agencies that have some skin in the game when it comes to water supply issues. So what happens when we actually issue a drought order? So four major things. The key thing is that when we have a drought emergency in effect, the Department of Ecology is authorized to do expedited processing for emergency drought permits for people that already have water rights. And so if they are, say, on a creek, the river gets so low that their intake is stranded, up in the air, they want to go to groundwater, we can kind of facilitate these kind of changes. And we can do temporary transfers of water rights, say where you have a junior water right holder who, because river flows are getting so low, they might be curtailed, under the system of prior appropriation. If they can work on an agreement with someone who has a senior water right, do a transfer of a water right, to get on the senior side of that equation in terms of priority, and then avoid curtailment, we can facilitate those kinds of transfers as well on an emergency basis. And we take those applications and then we're required to issue a decision within 15 days. And if you know anything about water right application timelines, which can be years, 15 days is pretty extraordinary. But again, that's only for people that already have a water right. We also, under a drought order, and assuming we get money from the legislature, we can support funding assistance for public entities, local districts, cities, PUDs, counties, for those entities that themselves have water supply issues. And then we pass through a lot of money to our fellow sister agencies like Fish and Wildlife, State Conservation Commission, Agriculture, and for them to again support kind of their customer base, their water sector in terms of workshops, public education, and local conservation districts. So just to put some context here, where is most of the action when we have declared droughts in Washington State? Most of it is on the east side, along the east slope of the Cascades, and where we have a lot of irrigated agriculture. Most of it's in the Yakima Basin. And very rarely do we have emergency applications on the west side. We have had a few in the Whatcom area. I know that in 2019, we processed an application, was an emergency water right transfer, where a junior water right holder wanted to get on the right side of the equation. So they did a transfer with a senior water right. So what is normal water supply? So, as Crystal mentioned, we always have lots of natural variability in terms of our water availability. So we have a definition in our regulation that actually defines that. And so normal water supply is the median amount of water available to a geographical area. And we use median relative to the 30-year base period. So currently 1981 through 2010, that's used to define climate normals. And we consider seasonal water supply forecasts. In particular, we really hone in on April through September. That's our most sensitive time of the year. And we can also consider kind of sub-seasonal departures. where we have extreme conditions. So you could have a good snowpack year, but a really warm, dry spring that could set you up for problems later in the summer as flows get low. So now that you kind of know what normal water supply is, you can actually sort of become your own drought forecaster at home. And what you see here is a river forecast map from NOAA, the Northwest River Forecast Center, which expresses the forecasted runoff in terms of percent of normal for April through September. And every day, the Forecast Center updates their forecast. They run ensemble models. Obviously, we're already halfway into April through September. And you can look up in the Whatcom Nooksack area, you can see those flags, 100, in the forks of the Nooksack, 100, 123, 96. So this year, Nooksack is in really good shape in terms of water supply, about a typical median or average year in terms of water supply. So I don't think we really expect to see any problems this year up in Whatcom County. Let me know if I'm wrong. So hardship, how do we look at hardship? And I like to say that hardship is impacts that hit hard, and something more than normal wear and tear, something more than where we have to tighten our belts. And hardship is when your ability to cope, as at risk of being overwhelmed. And so in practice at the state level, we look for helping out the kinds of taking action that helps us avoid crop losses, avoids interruption of drinking water supplies, and prevents mortality of fish and wildlife, especially from fish stranding as rivers get too low. Okay. And I just want to say it's so important as you go through these drought episodes to pay attention to impacts, because we always learn from every, Crystal talked about the flavors of drought, and paying attention to, who was affected in those particular drought years, because that's critical to help us anticipating hardship in the future drought years under similar conditions, who's vulnerable, who needs resources, who got hurt under this kind of level of condition. And we can build a period of record of those impacts and then compare it to the physical conditions that we experienced. And again, we're looking for the ability to distinguish, kind of normal wear and tear that we all have to kind of go through in terms of managing water versus an inability to cope where we need to direct resources. And so here is a kind of a chart of runoff, ranked by runoff, and this is every year, the runoff April to September. And that red line is the runoff forecasted for this year, 2020. And again, it's not quite complete. We're in July, but it's a forecast for April to September. You can see we're just shy of the median year for this period of record. But I want to draw your attention to the lowest runoff year is April through September for Whatcom County in the past 70 years. The lowest 3 years all happened within the past 5 years, 2015, 2016, and 2019. That's extremely interesting to me. I don't know if that's a indicator of climate change in terms of snowpack up there, or it's just natural variability, some dry years all in a row, some warm dry years. But in terms of impacts, if you remember how you were affected in those years, then you have a good idea of how vulnerable you are in drought years. Perhaps you didn't feel a thing, or perhaps your well got low, or your water right was curtailed. Perhaps you saw fish stranded in certain streams. But now that you know that, you can use that information in the future. So if the forecast indicates a year like one of those 3 years, you have some idea what you need to do, to get ready. So that's why it's really important to track impacts in relationship to the physical conditions that were present when those impacts occurred. So I mentioned that we had some new drought legislation this winter. And this incorporated a number of recommendations of our update of our drought plan. And the key things are, we now have the authority to issue a drought advisory Previously, we were limited to declaring a drought emergency, but the advisory tool gives us some ability to communicate to the public when we think conditions are worrisome, likely to be below normal. And it's a way to give heads up to the public and for folks to start being vigilant about their own water supply and start taking actions that they need to do to start preparing. We also got the authority to support drought preparedness actions outside the context of a drought emergency. That means we can spend money when a drought emergency is not in effect in support of long-term drought resiliency actions. So we wanted to get away from, kind of the emphasis on drought emergency and get to the position where we can support long-term resiliency actions. It just works better, more practical, because it takes time to put these projects in place. We also got the authority to do some long-term water right leasing, dry year lease options, and we're pursuing that. We'll be setting those up this fall. We got some basins identified on the east side, excuse me there. And the statute also authorizes the public to petition for drought declaration status. So if the state hasn't declared drought near watershed and you think we've overlooked something, maybe it's hardship, maybe we got our hydrology wrong, you can petition us, let us know that you think drought should be declared in your watershed. All right, so the legislation also gave us the authority to issue drought resiliency grants, as I mentioned. Those won't be rolling out anytime soon because the state budget situation is pretty dire given the COVID situation. But once we get money in the bank, here are kind of a list of the projects the legislature has specified that we'll be able to support with drought grant projects. Okay, this is my last slide here. I see I'm running a little long here. So last year, we declared drought across much of the state, 2019. That gave us some money that we could then share with the State Conservation Commission, which in turn shared with local conservation districts such as Whatcom County. And they got about $25,000 to do various technical assistance efforts like outreach and on-farm irrigation water management planning with landowners, and also for the installation of 5 new ag weather stations and soil moisture sensors that can be integrated into this irrigation water management planning to help farmers be more, judicious and efficient with their water use. So that benefits them and then also benefits in-stream flows. So by taking less water out of the river or the groundwater. Okay, so that's my last slide. And thanks very much. There's my contact information. If you have any questions about anything I talked about here, please give me a call or send me an email.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. And we are a little behind schedule. So
Sorry about that.
Oh, don't worry about it. I know that was a lot of ground to cover in a short amount of time. So we do have an open Q&A session for all the panelists from the morning session. And I do see that there is a question and I've put it in my notes and we'll bring it back up in a couple minutes after we hear from Andy Dunn. So at this time, I do want to introduce Andy Dunn. Andy is a water rights expert and licensed hydrogeologist. He assists RH2's clients with water rights analysis, water right processing, reclaimed water permitting, water supply planning and development, aquifer testing and analysis, water system planning, technical document review and critique, hydrologic and hydrogeologic testing and field measurements. So prior to RH2 Engineering, Andy served as a section manager and hydrogeologist permit writer for the Washington Department of Ecology's Water Resources Program and the Northwest Regional Office. So Andy, I will go ahead and turn the virtual floor over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Carly. So I am going to present on Whatcom County's drought contingency plan. So we have learned about what the federal government's doing. We've learned about what the state's doing, and now we're going to zoom in on Whatcom County's plan itself. So as a little background, the Whatcom PUD obtained a grant from Reclamation that led to this process. RH2 was involved in helping the PUD prepare the drought contingency plan. And one of the things that I wanted to mention right up front is that all of this is voluntary. So different sectors' participation in the drought contingency plan preparation and also implementation going forward is completely voluntary. There are no unfunded mandates in this plan. And so just wanted to put that out there right up front. As Darion showed earlier, Whatcom County is the only county in Washington state that has prepared a drought contingency plan. So Whatcom County is really on the cutting edge of this. And I think as others have mentioned, you know, it allows entities in Whatcom County and sectors in Whatcom County to be well positioned to take advantage of drought resiliency grants and other monies that might become available since this plan is already in place. So one of the important pieces of the drought contingency plan in Whatcom County was the establishment of the drought contingency plan task force. And that task force included many sectors listed here, such as public water systems, individual water systems, agriculture, fisheries and in-stream flows, terrestrial wildlife, forestry, energy, and recreation. So it wanted to look at the impacts of drought from the lens of all those different sectors. You know, it didn't want to just focus on public water systems or irrigation. You know, it wanted to look at the potential impacts of drought, the vulnerabilities, and then also potential mitigation measures and response actions for those different sectors. So the plan, how it's currently organized, is the first part of the plan discusses drought monitoring. And Whatcom County, the task force decided to rely on the state's drought monitoring process. As Jeff mentioned, I can't remember if they were described as the nerds or the geeks, but the task force felt that that group had the brain power and did not need any assistance, and there was no need for duplication on review of the hydrologic conditions that might bring about drought. So relying on the state there. Next was the vulnerability assessment, and this is again is for each of those sectors that I mentioned before. Just how are they vulnerable to drought? Next is mitigation measures, which are the steps taken during the non-drought periods to alleviate the adverse impacts of a drought. And as Jeff mentioned, historically, drought has been very reactionary. You know, you realize the well's dry and you try to fix that problem. Now there's much more emphasis on planning ahead and figuring out how to solve that problem before it happens. So when it does happen, it is a response action that has already been thought about and prepared. So mitigation measures are what you do ahead of time. Response actions are what you do when the drought is upon you. And then the plan has operational and administrative framework, plan update process, because things do change over time. And then finally, communication and outreach, of which this presentation is part of that. So the implementation steps, the Bureau of Reclamation approved the county's drought contingency plan in October of this last year. Since then, now that the plan has been approved, the task force members have been encouraged to take those plans to their respective groups for integration into long-term planning efforts that might be occurring around the county. There is a task force representative that participates in the WASAC group that Jeff mentioned as they are looking at water supply conditions leading up to the summertime to see if there will be a drought. So the task force participates in that, and that representative can then report back to the task force how conditions are looking. You know, keep the Whatcom County folks up to date. The task force has also expressed an interest in pushing for representation on the EWEC, which is the Governor's Executive Water Emergency Committee. If that hydrologic, 75% of the median conditions are met, the task force would like to provide local knowledge of the hardships that might be encountered due to that lack of water availability. And so since this plan is in place, and as Jeff mentioned, I think that the county has an excellent opportunity to participate in that committee or be requested to be asked and considered in that process when it is looking like there might be a drought declaration. The task force pre-COVID was scheduled to meet regularly on a quarterly basis. This, everything's up in the air a little bit now, but they will meet regularly to identify vulnerabilities and undertake those mitigation measures and potentially support one another if they do end up applying for any of the drought or resiliency grants. And then they can also meet as needed if a drought is declared. So they have the flexibility to meet more regularly if drought conditions are present and they need to be in closer communication, whether it's for just local organization and or for communication to the Executive Water Emergency Committee on potential hardships. So that is a summary of the Whatcom County Drought Contingency Plan. This is a little peek into what we'll be discussing this afternoon after the lunch break. We will go into discuss the water sources and drought impacts. And then we will have discussions from on a sector-specific basis in which we'll hear from fisheries, public water systems, individual water systems, agriculture, and forestry, in which they will identify the vulnerabilities, mitigation measures, and response actions that they feel are important for their particular sectors. And so that will be what is covered in this afternoon session. And that is it for my presentation on the Whatcom County Drought Contingency Plan. And there's my contact information, and try to run a little short to make up for Jeff Marti being a little long-winded there.
All right, great, thanks, Andy. So now we're in the general Q&A. So if folks have questions for Crystal, Raymond, for Darion, Mayhorn, Jeff Marti, or Andy, you're welcome to ask those questions again in the chat or by raising your hand if you would like to verbally ask your question. One question we did have that we weren't able to get to during Darion's presentation was, what water uses have the highest priority in emergency situations? People, industry, or agriculture, or other uses? So Darion, if you could answer that question.
Yeah, I can answer that. Carly, I apologize. I only heard part of that question.
Oh, sure.
You said what was the sectors?
Yeah, what water uses have the highest priority in emergency situations? Is it people, industry, agriculture, or maybe another sector?
Gotcha. Yeah, so that's a very good question. So for reclamation, emergency response actions, I don't think that we've had an issue where we've had to prioritize in that way. I think it's all important to us. There have been some projects where it has been primarily focused on getting water to people. There have been other occasions where it is primarily focused on fish and wildlife and other habitat for endangered and threatened species. So I don't think that we put weight of one over another. I think as much as we can try to find an opportunity to support all those different sectors.
All right, great. We did have a question for Jeff that Jeff did answer in the chat. So I'm gonna move on from there. We have some more questions that have come in. So this one is to you, Andy. Does the county drought contingency plan account for climate change or more frequent droughts in any way? Was that discussed?
I will caveat on first, for those of you that know Jim Bucknell, he was the one at RH2 that prepared this plan, and he has since retired. And so I don't know right off the top of my head on that one. It's all the same thing. It's all a water availability, water supply issue, whether it is drought and or climate change. And so, as Jeff mentioned, there seems to be a cluster of them more recently. Things seem to be getting worse, and so that is it's the lack of water availability, whatever that driver might be.
And hey, Andy, this is Darion. I can kind of add on to that if it's okay with you. Andy, is that fine?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So just so that people know, as part of this drought contingency planning grant that Whatcom County Public Utility District received, as part of the vulnerability assessment, we have a requirement in there that folks consider basically climate change within their analyses, right? So the development of the vulnerability assessment and then the resulting mitigation actions and response actions that come out of that consider climate change, right? And they also should consider perhaps more frequent droughts, if that's what perhaps the science is suggesting will happen, or perhaps a change in precipitation patterns, right? Change in snowpack, change in stream flow or runoff, whatever it might look like. Those are things that would have been considered in the vulnerability assessment as part of the program requirements.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Darion.
Okay, and then we have two questions that are somewhat similar for, that I might just combine into one. And again, these are to Andy or perhaps others on the Whatcom Drought Contingency Plan Task Force. So are Whatcom Task Force meetings public meetings that are subject to the Open Public Meetings Act? The second question related to that is, how can private domestic well owners participate in the Drought Contingency Plan Task Force meetings? Will they be open to the public?
I believe the task force meetings are public meetings. I don't know, Rebecca or Becky, if you want to clarify that.
This is Rebecca. Steve just answered that question on the chat.
In I'll read the response just for the recording's sake. So the Drought Contingency Plan Task Force meetings are not currently subject to the Open Public Meetings Act, saying that we will be discussing with the task force to provide public access to these meetings.
And there was a question regarding who's on the task force, and I would direct everyone to the link on the PUD's. You go to the Whatcom PUD's website, we have the task force, we have the whole plan there, and in that plan lists everybody that was on the task force originally. If you want to, rather than me listing everybody, I think someone sent me a question about who's on the task force. Pretty broad group of people were on there, just to say. Just go to the go to the PUD website and look at the plan, and the task force is listed in the plan.
Great, and then I will have one more question, and then we'll move to wrap up. So, would the Bureau of Reclamation consider aquifer recharge plan funding for exploration, pilot, or construction? So I guess it's a question about exploration of aquifer recharge projects, if the Bureau would fund that.
Yeah, I can speak to that. So in the drought contingency planning process, right, one of the things that we ask folks to do is to identify mitigation actions. And perhaps one of the mitigation actions that a community would want to take is aquifer storage and recovery. So that's an option. And then further, when we go to those drought resiliency projects, right, which are those opportunities for us to actually implement those mitigation actions, aquifer storage and recovery is an eligible project type. So we fund the kind of design and construction of those, but ultimately it needs to get to the construction phase. So we won't just fund kind of like exploring or piloting. We more so will fund someone that's done the planning. They have an idea of their recharge rates, what it is that they plan to do, and are in that place where they're ready to actually implement that project.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks everybody for your presentations and your answers to the questions that have come in. So at this point, we will now, we're just about ready to break for lunch. So again, thanks again to our presenters and the participants for your questions. Before you go, I want to point out that there's a survey that WWIN and the Whatcom MRC would like you to complete for this morning's session. The link to the survey is posted in the chat by Cheryl. So when you complete the survey, and you can optionally include your name, including your name will allow you to be entered into a drawing for a gift card. So we just say that as a caveat. But yeah, please take a moment to do that. It should only take 2 minutes of your time. And we will be on break until about 1 o'clock. And yes, we are starting at 1 o'clock sharp with more presentations. During this time, attendees are welcome to stay logged in and then come back around 12:55 is what I would encourage. So we'll make sure everything's on mute and we will see you then. All right, it's now 1 o'clock and I want to welcome everybody back, or welcome you if this is the first time you're logging in to the speaker series event. If you weren't able to join the morning session, this morning we heard about the big picture of climate impacts on water supply locally in the Nooksack and drought planning and preparedness. Let's see. So for this afternoon, we will focus more on the local drought planning effort and how specific sectors like forestry and public and private water systems in Whatcom County would be impacted by a drought and what can be done to reduce those impacts. Just a reminder that we will be hearing from diverse perspectives and points of view throughout this event. And again, this webinar is being recorded, and a recording of today's webinar will be posted on WWIN.org in the next day or so. Additionally, there are some ground rules for the webinar. All participant cameras and microphones are muted for this event. There will be opportunities to ask questions verbally by raising your hand after each speaker talk or during designated question and answer periods. You may also ask questions by using the chat feature. However, those questions won't be answered until the Q&A segment. Given the short time that will be available for questions, please try to keep your question concise and specific. So now we will move to our first speaker of the afternoon, and that is Sue Blake, who will provide some localized context on water sources in Whatcom County. And I'll first start by introducing Sue. Sue Blake retired in 2020 after 30 years of working for Washington State University, Washington Sea Grant, and local governments. She has a Bachelor's of Science in Freshwater Ecosystems and a Master of Science in Water Resource Management. Her work in Whatcom County focused on a wide variety of water resource issues and programs, including numerous watershed planning efforts, groundwater and stormwater management, education and outreach, shellfish protection, and technical assessment. So Sue, thanks for taking the time to be with us this afternoon, and I will turn it over to you. And I think you're on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me? Okay,
Yes.
Great. Thanks, Carly. Welcome everybody to the afternoon session for our drought contingency plan. Great to see so many familiar faces in the attendee list, and hope everybody is staying safe in these weird pandemic times. I had no idea that's what I'd be retiring to, but it's made for things to be a little bit different than what I anticipated. But I'm happy to be here this afternoon, and I've been asked to take a sort of very big picture look at what our water sources are, some of their characteristics, how we use them from really, again, a 30,000-foot view up. Hopefully this will help you understand a little bit more about some of the challenges that some of the sectors are facing, as you hear from each one of those later on this afternoon. So, all right, this is supposed to move. Can you help me understand why it's not actually going? All right, there.
Oh, there you go.
Okay, thanks. So the great news here in Whatcom County is that we actually do have a ton of water resources here. Every time I look at this list, it's hard for me to understand why we have so many problems, and that we've, it's basically taken many people decades and we're still working on them. But we're lucky because we have a great diversity and a great number of resources to work from, but timing is everything. And we got a bit of a sense of that from some of the speakers this morning. And our problems are that we don't have water where we need it for all of our uses during the times of the year that things are particularly stressed during the summertime. So to take a little bit more close look at what we mean by that, it's always good to remind yourself about what the water cycle is. And there's two things I want you to take from this. One is that all of those resources that were on the previous slide are constantly cycling. They're moving. They don't just sit there. They move from precipitation to rainfall, it might be snow, it might be rain, down into our rivers and streams, ultimately estuaries and marine waters. And one of the ones, and you heard a lot from Crystal this morning about what that means for some of our river systems that are dependent on snowpack or precipitation, or in our case, glaciers actually as well. But the one thing that wasn't talked a whole lot about was the groundwater component of this. And I just want to highlight these arrows for groundwater discharge. Groundwater is a really important resource here to us locally. And again, it doesn't just fall on the ground and go vertically down into the groundwater system and stay there. It actually moves laterally as well. And those groundwater sources are really important especially during the drier times of the year, in supporting not only the users of the groundwater, but also the freshwater, surface water sources like our rivers, streams, and lakes. So let's take a little bit closer look at what we have in terms of some of those resources. This is a map that shows our annual precipitation here in Whatcom County. And you don't really need to so much pay attention to the numbers, but just know that there's a gradation from the coast precipitation, which is in the upper 30s to 40s, all the way up to over 200 inches at Mount Baker there, characterized by the blue. And again, you kind of look at that and go, well, it rains a lot here. How can we have the kind of problems that we do? But once again, timing is everything. And the fact of the matter is that, we really don't have wet summers here. Our wet times of the year is not the summertime. This is an illustration of a number of precipitation at 5 different sites in the lowlands of the basin a number of years ago. But the pattern is similar, although what I would say is we've had many more years where you can see a lot less than 2 inches of rainfall in the summer at some of those sites. So we've definitely had some times that have been more challenging, but bottom line is we don't get a lot of rain in the summer here. And that's, again, when we need it most for a lot of the uses. And I'll show that a little bit later. So the other thing, just to provide an illustration of, is we heard from Crystal about some of the snowpack issues. We're really lucky to have Mount Baker. Mount Baker is the second most glaciated peak in the Cascade Range in Washington, second only to Mount Rainier. But we may not have the glaciers. They're receding. So their contribution to flow is going to be shifting over the decades as well. But it benefits us because it provides that basically runoff during the dry times of the year here that we wouldn't otherwise have. So here's a quick look at our river systems, their lake streams, and you can find this in the Drought Contingency Plan. And here's how it flows through the major watersheds. The yellow is the Nooksack River system. And what you can see there is, here's the North Fork, Middle Fork, and Mount Baker there. These are the ones that are really the glacially fed areas, as well as the snowpack from the South Fork. All of these other lowland streams that fall in these watersheds, they don't have the benefit of the snowpack. So they're just relying on rainfall in the summer. Here's our groundwater aquifer system. We have an extensive system. You don't need to know what the names of the units are. They're just color coded by the units. And I like this picture because it also shows what the depth to water is. And the light green means it's pretty shallow. From a groundwater perspective, that's 50 to 75 feet. So how do we use water? There's a couple of different ways to look at it. One is the water that we have to take out, which we call out of stream uses. It's irrigation, it's domestic, industrial, commercial water supplies. And then the rest is water that remains in the system, and it's the things that support our in-stream fisheries, our marine and freshwater systems, all the plants and animals, whether they're terrestrial or basically water-based, that what we have here is highly dependent and tied to the amount of water that we've got. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the out-of-stream uses, and you can divide them into, again, these are the ones that are taking water out. Residential, typically public and private systems. We have nearly 500 public water systems and about 16,000 wells serving private water systems. It's mostly wells for the private water systems. We have a lot of irrigated agriculture, industry, and the other category. But what you can see in the little chart on the right-hand side is that agriculture is really the biggest user. And this is a good illustration of what that means in the summertime. Blue is irrigation. And you can see, again, we have the most need for irrigation during the time when we have the least water available from a precipitation standpoint. And the geographic distribution of agricultural needs as well as our domestic, these are both pictures that just sort of show the lay of the land. What I want you to take from this is simply that our agriculture and our public water systems are scattered throughout the entire county. We can't focus on one particular area to solve or address the issues, because it's really, it's the lowlands that we all live and play and work in. And major surface water uses, just touch on them. Agriculture, Henry's going to give you a little bit more information about this. I'd say it's about 25, but sometimes estimates are 30% of the total water use for agriculture comes from our lowland streams. Public water systems, this is a map here that shows the city of Bellingham's water sources. And I threw that one up here because the city of Bellingham is the single biggest provider of drinking water in the county, and they rely on the Lake Whatcom watershed, but we're all in this together. And you can see that pink line here. This is a tunnel that goes to the middle fork of the Nooksack. So when supplies might be low in Lake Whatcom, they have the ability to transfer water from the rest of the watershed into the lake. Linden is also a major user of surface waters through the Nooksack River, and the PUD takes water from the Nooksack to supply industries at Cherry Point. And then finally, just a quick snapshot of the wells and groundwater uses. Here's just a map that shows a record of the wells that are in Department of Ecology's database from 1937 to 2013. You don't really need to look at the red or the green. I just want you to see that we have wells scattered throughout the entire county. And most of these public water systems, of that about 500 that I talked about, 475, by far and away, most of those folks are using groundwater. And they're one of those wells probably located up there. The bigger systems you might be more familiar with are Ferndale, Blaine, Birch Bay, and Sumas. Most of those 16,000 individual systems that you're going to hear more about today as well, those are tapped into largely the groundwater sources out in the county. There are a handful that, little more than a handful, that get water from lakes like Lake Samish or Lake Whatcom. And then finally, the big agricultural users. So my summary of this section is simply that while we have a diverse and abundant supply of water resources, it doesn't always match when and where we need it in the dry times of the year. Our out-of-stream uses are greatest when we also have the least water available, and it is a constant challenge to try and make sure that our out-of-stream uses still allow water to remain in the rivers, streams, and other water bodies for all those other things that are so important to us. Drought conditions, whether due to any of the three factors that were in the cone of that Crystal showed earlier today, those can exacerbate the problems that we've already got. And so it's a great opportunity to have this drought plan to help us refocus in on some of the things that we can actions we can take in the individual sectors to help address some of the problems that we're going to be facing. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Sue, for your great overview and characterization of the watershed. And we have time for questions. If anybody has any for Sue, you may raise your hand or type them into the chat. And just a reminder that we do have a link in the chat, and maybe I'll share it again for the Whatcom County Drought Contingency Plan. I'll share it once more just in case folks were not logged in earlier, since we will be, after this presentation, jumping right into the drought vulnerability um, and drought hazards in Whatcom County based on this plan. And since I'm not seeing, oh, we might have one. So there's a question from a tool. It might be worth repeating the question of the Fraser River connection with Sioux. Let me scroll up to find that. Let's see.
This is Rebecca. It was from Alan. I believe this is the question.
Mm-hmm.
Consider the impacts of climate change in the Fraser watershed on the resources in the Nooksack. Are you aware of model projections in that region? That was a question to Crystal this morning. I think that's the one he's referring to.
Okay, yeah. I don't know if you could provide any insight to that, Sue, but we'll give it a try.
No, I can't, unfortunately. We all know we are clearly influenced tremendously by the Fraser River system, but I can't say that I've seen any climate modeling that's brought that into it. So unfortunately, no.
And unfortunately, there's another question that popped into the chat, but we have to move into our next presentation to stay on time. So I want to introduce or reintroduce Andy Dunn, who was our last speaker in the morning session and is now going to be talking about drought hazards and vulnerabilities from Whatcom County's Drought Contingency Plan. And Andy works with RH2 Engineering, and I will turn it over to you, Andy.
All right.
All right. Thanks again. So I'm going to give the overview of some drought hazards and vulnerabilities, and then we will go into the individual sectors that will provide their own information on vulnerabilities, mitigation measures, and response actions. So for the Whatcom County Drought Contingency Plan, the approach for the assessment was that the task force was convened, and then the knowledge and expertise of those on the task force was utilized. It wasn't something that the PUD or RH2 dictated. These are the vulnerabilities that you guys have. It was the different sectors were asked about the vulnerabilities that they had or they felt, and that is how they were identified for the plan. And so once those had been received from the various sectors, then mitigation measures were discussed again within the task force, and to try to figure out, how can we address these potential vulnerabilities from a planning standpoint or up front. So for a public water system, for instance, if it has one source of supply that could be at risk, maybe an intertie with a neighboring system that has a firmer source of supply would be an example of a mitigation measure. So in doing that, you have to, work with your neighbor to get permission to connect to them. You have to design the connection. You have to get it permitted through the Department of Health. So there's a number of things that you can do that are much preferred to do outside of the actual drought emergency itself, but you get that in place so that you then can come in with your response action, which would be actually activating the intertie in this particular example during the drought. So it's a much simpler process to alleviate that or reduce that vulnerability once the drought is actually upon you. And so that was the approach for the drought contingency plan assessment. And then the range of vulnerabilities that were identified by the various sectors are across the board. I'll touch on a number of them here. There are some interruptible water rights in Whatcom County, which means that when the flow of the Nooksack River gets to or below a certain level, they have to stop utilizing water or to stop taking water from the source. And so obviously drought conditions where you have those lower summer flows, those folks are going to get interrupted or regulated earlier on in the year. Another vulnerability is single sources of supply, which just is a lack of redundancy. So if you have a single source, and if for some reason, wherever that water is coming from is impacted by drought, then you're at risk there, vulnerable. Much of the county has a shallow groundwater that is tapped by shallow wells, and so if the groundwater levels were to drop, that represents a vulnerability for those wells. And then the drought has it's kind of a double-edged sword, that drought can cause reduced physical availability of water, but it also causes warmer weather and drier conditions, which most people say, hey, I need to irrigate my landscaping more to keep it alive or to keep the garden growing. And so they actually increase their water use during those drought periods. And for groundwater wells out by the coast, saltwater intrusion can be a concern. If the water levels are declining, it can cause that groundwater saltwater wedge to move inshore. It can actually impact the water quality in wells. When there is less water in the streams, you can get reduced rearing habitat. There's just physically not as much water there, not as much real estate for the fish to utilize in streams. Increased water temperatures can cause thermal barriers for fish. It can cause algal growth in water bodies that can interfere with diversions and intakes. As we discussed before, climate change, those glaciers up in Mount Baker are nice. They provide a lot of that winter or summertime flow right now, but what happens when those glaciers are gone and that reservoir of water is not available there? Wildfire, it impacts the logging industry. It also has implications for water quality in the runoffs, erosion that can happen after a wildfire, and so there are issues there. And then even recreational opportunities. So if you have less snow, there's less people going up to Mount Baker to ski and snowboard. There's less flow in the rivers, so there might be less recreation that way. And then you can have closures to recreational fishing and or areas due to the potential for wildfire concerns and or just to protect fish species if they are in a very a reduced or a small river and under stress due to the heating or the conditions in that particular river. So the vulnerabilities are very widespread and diverse depending on the sector that is interested in it. And so I'll touch on, and Sue touched on these a little bit, but the larger municipal suppliers that use direct surface water as their source include the City of Bellingham, City of Linden, and Whatcom PUD. Linden and Whatcom PUD utilize the lower Nooksack River. Bellingham utilizes Lake Whatcom with potential for supplementation from the Middle Fork and Nooksack River. And then some of the larger groundwater municipalities using groundwater include the City of Blaine and Birch Bay Water and Sewer District, and the City of Ferndale. And these larger municipal suppliers, in looking at their vulnerabilities, the thing that they feel the most vulnerable to, I guess, is uncertainties about the potential impacts of long-term drought. So most of these sources can handle a year, a season, a year, that sort of length of drought. They've done it in the past. They'll likely do it again. But there is concern that, what if we have a year-on-year drought or a few years in a row, what happens to those sources under those conditions? And so that's something that they'll just have to plan for into the future. And that is, what they identified as being their particular vulnerability at this time. And so that concludes kind of the overview of drought hazards and the vulnerabilities that we're seeing and were referenced in the drought contingency plan. Thank you.
All right. Do we have any questions for Andy?
I do see there's a question in the chat box there about deep aquifers in the county versus just the shallow aquifer. There are both. The shallow aquifer, also referred to as the Sumas Abbotsford aquifer, Sumas aquifer, is very prominent and prevalent up by kind of Linden in the Nooksack River flats there. But there are deeper aquifers such as those tapped by Blaine and Birch Bay. Those are much deeper aquifers up there in the northwest part of the county. And also Jay Chennault, who will be presenting later on individual water systems, he will touch on the deep aquifers briefly in his talk. So I won't steal any of his thunder there.
Okay, great. There was another question that was sent privately to me, and that's, and maybe it's more relevant for Jay because it has to do with aquifers as well. But do we know the status of our aquifers? Are they drawing down over time? Does the surface aquifer change each year? And I can always save this for Jay during his Q&A too.
I'll speak about in generalities, I guess. The Sumas aquifer, the shallow aquifer, it does fluctuate every year. It typically, from what I've seen, this is me, personal experience, it appears that the aquifer fills up each winter for the most part, and then during the summer months it does draw down, and then but within the Sumas aquifer, I do not believe I've seen any year-to-year declines. It will typically refill each winter, and so it does fluctuate, typically about 5 feet or so. The water level within the aquifer will fluctuate over the course of the year. So that's the shallow aquifer. It's easy to recharge from precipitation. It's right at the ground surface, and so that's the case there. Maybe I'll let Jay touch on the deeper aquifer. I don't have as much experience with the Blaine Birch Bay aquifer over there, and so maybe he can touch on that, being a deeper source.
All right, let's give it one more. I'll give it 30 seconds or so to see if any other questions come in through the chat. Otherwise, I think we will go ahead and move on to our next speaker, who is going to talk about fisheries impacts. So we'll now hear from Megan Kernan with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. Megan Kernan is the Water Policy Section Manager and Drought Coordinator for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. She has worked on drought, stream flow restoration, and other water policy related issues at WDFW for the past 2 years. Prior to joining WDFW, Megan spent a decade working on water resource issues for various nonprofit, federal, and academic institutions. Megan holds a Master of Science in Water Resources and a JD both from the University of Idaho. So Megan, please take it away.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. As you just mentioned, my name is Megan Kernan, and I am the Drought Coordinator for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've been asked to speak today about how drought conditions impact fish and what actions can be taken to ameliorate those impacts and create resiliency. So I'm going to start with an overview here. I will give a general overview of the family of fishes I'm going to focus on today. That's the family Salmonidae. I'll talk about how drought impacts in-stream resources, discuss how DFW responds in times of drought, and then I'll focus on some commonly seen drought impacts to fish and throw out some ideas for actions that would increase ecological robustness and resilience. So I'm focusing on a family of fishes that I bet most of you guys are at least somewhat familiar with, and that's the family Salmonidae. This includes the anadromous salmon native to the Pacific Northwest, but also includes rainbow trout, kokanee, bull trout, and cutthroat trout. I'm focusing on these species because of their immense importance to Northwest indigenous communities, both culturally and as a traditional food source. I'll focus on these species because of their economic value. Commercial and recreational fishing sectors in Washington are estimated to contribute over $2.5 billion annually. I'm also going to focus on these fishes because they're so important ecologically. They're food sources for orcas and other species, and they also bring marine nutrients into the upper watershed. So another reason why salmonids are often central to the discussion of drought in the Pacific Northwest is that they're especially vulnerable to drought conditions because they're a cold water fish. So unlike your smallmouth bass, perch, and other resident game fish, salmonids can't tolerate warm water temperatures. Generally speaking, water temperatures above 22 degrees Celsius can be fatal for these fish. And having elevated stream temperatures are especially problematic for salmonids because they spawn in fresh water. And in some species and stocks, the timing of that spawning migration coincides with summer heat and low flows. So anadromous fish, so that's those fish that go out and spend a portion of their life out at sea. They may spend 1 year, 2 years or more in the freshwater. Non-anadromous species like rainbow trout, cutthroat trout, kokanee, they spend their entire lives in freshwater. And the longer the residence time in freshwater, sort of the riskier drought conditions can be for these fish. In the case of anadromous fish, however, there's sort of a flip side to that coin. The longer they stay in freshwater before out migrating to sea, the larger the fish will grow. It gives them a better chance at survival at sea and a higher likelihood that they'll return to their natal stream to spawn. So the time spent in our streams and rivers are important to the fecundity of the fish. And when drought stresses these fish, it can impact the fish's ability to be reproductively successful. Okay, let me just. So speaking specifically about salmonids in the Nooksack watershed, the left part of this slide shows a chart that details the species and runs. Spring chinook, bull trout, along with summer steelhead are particularly vulnerable to drought because they're migrating upstream to their spawning grounds during these summer low flow periods. Not coincidentally, those three same species are federally protected under the Endangered Species Act as threatened. So that's evidence that, you know, these salmon or these stocks of fish aren't doing so great. So suffice it to say, many salmonids in the Nooksack are already struggling. The causes for these declines include loss of habitat, degraded water quality, insufficient stream flows, overharvest, to name a few. And these factors are exacerbated by the drought conditions. So I'm going to take a couple minutes to talk about the physical drought conditions that occur in stream. Obviously, drought is primarily characterized as some kind of reduction of water supply, whether it be a precipitation drought, snowpack drought, or some other flavor, as we heard it described today. Droughts result in reduced stream flows. So reduced flows mean less riverine habitat is available for fish. It also alters sediment regimes. Low flows can result in fish getting stranded and becoming disconnected in pools of water, or the lowering flows can cause barriers to form within the stream, acting as dams within the channel. So the slide I'm showing here is it's basically a hydrograph. It's showing flow. It's showing the 2015 drought on the South Fork of the Nooksack. In the blue line is flow in 2015, and the yellow sort of dotted line is the median statistic for that same day over a period of time. And you can see how the 2015 drought really impacted flows. It looks like the mean flow on August 1st was somewhere within the ballpark of 200 CFS, but in 2015, during that drought period, it was down to around 70 CFS. Today I looked at the flow and it just happened to look at the same sensor, and the flow for today is sitting around 330 CFS. So sort of as Jeff mentioned in his presentation, Nooksack water supply is actually looking pretty good. So that's a good thing. We're not in bad shape right now. In times of drought, it's not just, we're not just concerned with the lack of water, but it's also sort of the water quality and water temperature. I mentioned earlier that salmonids are cold water fish. They become stressed in water at about 18 degrees Celsius, and temperatures above 22 can prove to be fatal. Warm water increases the metabolism of fish, requiring them to find more food to eat to survive. Warm waters can also increase a fish's susceptibility to disease. And as the water warms, there's less available dissolved oxygen that hinders the fish's ability to respire. So this graph is from the same point as the previous slide and the same time period, but instead of showing flow, it's showing temperature. 2015 again, and it looks like the temperatures for this period of time topped out at 25 degrees Celsius around the beginning of July. I think the median daily statistic looks like it's about, I guess 13 and a half, I'd say. And I checked today what the temperature was at this sensor, and it's sitting at about 15 degrees this morning. So pretty much average with respect to this year again. So I'm going to talk for a second about DFW's response to drought. Jeff Marti in his presentation introduced some of these concepts. The Water Supply Availability Committee, or WASAC, while DFW doesn't necessarily sit on that committee because we're not a forecasting type agency, we certainly participate as sort of viewers and use that information to better understand streamflow forecasts and climatic conditions. We do sit on the EWEC committee that Jeff also spoke on. We provide insight about potential hardships to our sector, so how drought conditions or water supply conditions might impact fish and wildlife. And you know, when a drought is declared, sometimes money is made available. Sometimes that money goes makes its way to our agency, and we're able to do a lot of sort of emergency work, which I'll talk about in a second, and also maybe help our partners do additional work. We only have so much regional staffing, so it's really helpful to have partnerships around the state that can help do some of this work and be some of the boots on the ground. So let's see here. So I'll briefly touch on some of the types of response work that we do in times of drought. I'll start with removal of recreational rock dams. So these are man-made structures that people make because it's hot and it's dry. People want to go down to the rivers and streams to cool off. And so they will alter the stream channel to create pools to hang out in. And these pools can unintentionally block fish passage, keep fish from moving upstream to spawn or downstream for outmigration. And DFW will either hear about these dams from folks that call in or email us, or sometimes our enforcement and field staff might come across them in their other activities in the field. Depending on the situation, we'll either remove the impediment or work with another partner to see to it that this barrier is removed. This picture, I can't remember off the top of my head where it is, but you can definitely see that there's man-made structure on the left-hand side, creating the water, you know, is backing up, creating a pool. And so we, with some of our partners, came in and removed that. And now in the right-hand side, you can see how it's a free-flowing stream. A fish could easily move up and down that, even though the flow is low. So another fish passage issue that frequently comes up during drought conditions is streams can go completely subsurface before entering another water body, resulting in the complete disconnection of the two water bodies. These pictures are of let's see, Box Canyon Creek, which enters Cochise Reservoir in the Upper Yakima. Our biologists monitor this area weekly during low water periods because Box Canyon Creek is important as a spawning ground for ESA listed bull trout. Those trout spend the summer in the reservoir but move into the rivers to spawn. And if they can't make their spawning gravels because of the disconnection, it's really unlikely that they would be able to reproduce successfully. So in these pictures, basically what we're doing is building a slip and slide to carry the flow of the creek back down to the reservoir and sort of keep it from going subsurface. And this allows the bull trout to access their spawning area upstream of the installation. Another issue related to drought is that fish become more stressed as water becomes warmer and more susceptible to disease. So this picture was taken on the Lower Nacelle River and shows pre-spawn mortality of Chinook likely to be caused by a combination of infections and inadequate oxygen supply. The issue is compounded by the fact that when these flows get low, it compresses the fish into sort of a smaller area within the channel, and it makes the disease very difficult to treat. So overall, the number of fall Chinook that spawned at Nacelle in 2015 was 99, which is pretty low compared to the average spawner in that area. The number is 590 fish from the preceding, or that's the average number in the preceding years. So definitely has a significant impact. Another area of concern during drought is our hatcheries around the state. Often water resources for our hatcheries is usually based off of surface water. And as I've described earlier, that water becomes increasingly inhospitable to fish during drought. This means that hatchery staff may have to go release fish earlier in the year, basically before they've gotten to their ideal size, just to get them out of the raceways at the hatchery. Lack of oxygen is also a serious issue, not just because of the chemical reality that warmer water holds less oxygen, but because heat causes increases in the metabolic rate, which also means the fish are consuming oxygen at a higher rate. So this requires the installation of aeration mechanisms to keep the fish alive. We also put shade cloths over raceways to keep solar radiation from heating the water. And in some cases where we do have a groundwater source, we will potentially have to dig a new well. Like if that well goes dry, I think we've had that happen in certain areas where, because the water supply is so low, our wells are no longer productive enough. So those pictures on that side sort of shows what I've been describing, just those activities. So I'm going to move to a slightly different item, and that's the resiliency factor. How do we keep how do we maintain, levels of fish productivity in the face of drought? Well, one thing is certainly education and outreach. The slide shows a poster that we've been posting in popular sort of, I guess, bathing and recreation areas around the state where we've come across a lot of recreational rock dams, just letting people know basically like, this, it's fun to go out and hang out in the water, but there's impacts to fish that need to be considered. And I think that's been pretty effective, is just letting people know.
Megan, we seem to have lost your sound.
Oh, no.
No, I can hear Megan.
I can hear her too.
I'm really having a tough go.
I can hear Megan as well.
Yeah.
Okay, well, this is my last slide, so I'll just get through it, and then I'll take whatever questions folks have. So other sort of areas where we can get resiliency is from doing land acquisitions, protection of natural areas, restoration of watersheds. That usually that creates resiliency within the system. Water right acquisitions, things that create, allow for more flow to be added to streams when things are low. And that includes source switches, which is getting folks that have surface water diversions off of those in favor of groundwater wells, can really help during those low flow periods. And just increase water use efficiencies, not using as much water, or maybe not using more water than is needed to allow to keep some of that water in stream for fish and wildlife. So with that, I can take questions. This drought at dfw.wa.gov will go to me, even though it's not my actual email, and it's easier to remember. So.
Great. All right. Thanks, Megan, for your presentation. Do we have any questions? I don't see any in the chat at the moment. I'll ask a question since we're waiting. I guess, do you know of any in the last, so last year was a drought year, declared around the state. Off the top of your head or to your knowledge, do you know if there were any fisheries related impacts in Whatcom County?
So that's a great question. And I don't remember hearing anything specific where our agency did work related to fisheries in Whatcom County. I went through my files. I know that that's the focus of this, and I'm sort of a statewide person and don't have a lot of the granular details. But I know in 2015, I was flipping through pictures of recreational rock dams. I certainly saw some that were removed in Whatcom County. I just didn't use their pictures because they were kind of grainy, honestly. But yeah, it was hard. When we were getting hit by drought, we've been hit in the peninsula really hard. We get hit in Eastern Washington hard. I've only been in my position since last year, and I don't recall there being a specific incident in Whatcom County that required our folks to go in and get some work done.
Got it, thanks. Let's see. Here's a question. How are actions prioritized during a drought, i.e. stream river size? Also, how does habitat improvement increase the resiliency to drought impacts? And have these actions been funded from drought mitigation funding?
Okay, so I think I'll answer the second question first. So habitat restoration can increase resiliency by, if it's, let's say it's adding large woody debris or beaver dam analog type of installations that create heterogeneity within the system, creates more like pools for fish to hang out at when temperatures are getting warm in the riffles. It provides more habitat, more cover, and allows them to recuperate from stress. Some of those projects can also increase water tables or hold back water in a way that allows for more stream flow in that sort of low flow portion of the year. And as far as mitigation, whether or not that work has been paid for with sort of drought mitigation money, I'm not totally sure. With respect to DFW, we don't have specific drought mitigation resources. And when we do get resources appropriated during a drought declaration, it's been really made clear to us that that's for sort of emergency response work and not so much for resiliency type actions. The first part of your question, I think I've already sort of, if you wouldn't mind restating it.
It's how are actions prioritized during a drought?
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I wish I had a really good answer for that, but I don't. It's sort of the drought emergencies, when we're responding to them, it's kind of like we hear something. If we have money available to us to do response work, it's like, we just have to consider how is it a shovel, is something that we can actually make a difference with the resources we have. Is it something that's shovel ready that we can effectuate during a time period that makes sense? Like if this is August and we can't get the project underway until November, it may not be something that we can do. But essentially, we do the best we can with the limited resources we have, and certainly trying to prioritize is really difficult, especially because it's almost always under a time crunch. It's like that low water period starts to happen in late July, and we're working really hard through September to make all of these actions occur. And then some stuff, it's just that it takes too much time, and that's why some of these resilience efforts would be really helpful to sort of keep some of the problems from emerging. And of course, like ESA listed fish, there's certain things that are always going to rise to, be a high priority.
Thank you. Yeah, and thanks so much for your presentation and taking the time with us this afternoon. Now we will move on to our next speaker. We have Dave Olson presenting on public water systems. So Dave Olson has a bachelor's degree in business, is licensed as a Washington Department of Health State Certified Water Distribution Manager Level 3, Water Treatment Operator, and Cross Connection Control Specialist. Dave has served in Washington State as a Group A water system instructor for the Washington Environmental Training Center and the Washington State Department of Health, and received the Washington State Department of Health 2013 Above and Beyond Award for his efforts to address nitrate in drinking water. Dave has served on his local water association board and is engaged in local water issues, including the Whatcom County Coordinated Water System effort. Recognizing that local water systems were in turmoil and ill-equipped to face ever increasing and often confusing drinking water rules and regulations, he founded Water System Services Incorporated. And Water System Services is dedicated to providing a full range of technical, managerial, and administrative services, and currently works with over 50 water systems ranging in size from 1 to 1,000 approved connections, serving over 5,000 people and more than 5,000 cows. So please take it away, Dave.
Hello, everybody. Quick sound check and screen check.
Yep, we're good to go.
All right, well, let's just jump right in. We'll get into the overview portion here, looking at a few statistics. Some of these are directly from the Drought Contingency Plan. And so about 20% of the water use in Whatcom County is for residential purposes. And as we've heard, we have our two primary sources of water, our surface water and groundwater, clearly with different drought characteristics, potential impacts, and mitigation measures. And so about 40%, 46% of that population is served by surface water, and no surprise that is City of Billingham and Linden, and certainly there are other smaller out there around the lakes, being individual or very small systems. About 80% of the residents receive drinking water from public water systems, and so that's the world that I live in. And so here's a quick snapshot of the public water systems in Whatcom County. And a couple of takeaways from this snapshot here is you'll identify that there's a handful of larger ones that certainly dominate the landscape here, but you recognize that there's 576 actual water systems in Whatcom County. And so you're dealing with 576 governing bodies that certainly are trying to look out for their community, but it presents a lot of challenges when you're thinking of drought planning and preparedness and awareness for the customers in these systems. So we have two basic types of public water systems. We've got 283 Group A systems, and there's a little definition in the slide there. So if we're looking at 170,000 of the 172,000 residents that receive water from drinking water systems, the Group A certainly serve the most. But then we have an almost equal number, 293 Group B systems that have a different set of regulations that they operate under, and they're only serving 2,000 residents. So there's a pretty big dynamic there when we're talking about public water systems. Other statistics here, 77% of the population are served by 69 public water systems. So you can see even of the 283, the vast majority of residents get their water, public water, from a small number of systems. So that does help a bit when you're trying to get a consolidated, concise message for when you're dealing with drought or water use efficiency. And then the remaining equally impactful is we have 23% of the population, and this is the overall population now, served by 507 public systems, private water systems that wouldn't be included in the public list, generally 2 or smaller, and then thousands of individual wells that you'll hear about later. And so you can see how the larger systems serving a larger population are going to have greater awareness and resources for drought contingency, planning and preparedness in comparison to those smaller groups and the awareness of the individual well owners. And so when we talk about potential impact of drought, certainly it's going to vary by your duration of the drought, the degree of the supply shortfall, groundwater versus surface water, when the drought occurs, excuse me, and the infrastructure capacity that's there. And so as you heard from Sue earlier, most public water systems are resilient to short-term drought impacts, and yet most systems depend on a single source of water, and often these are shallow wells. And so we can see where drought can reduce groundwater resources and the replenishment of those depending on the length and the timing of the drought. And so we can see dry wells, saltwater intrusion when we overpump our wells, and reduce pumping capacity. And in many cases, because we have single wells, excuse me, we have no alternative source or interties generally available. Hope I make it through the end of this. So it's important to understand the potential impact of drought and the way in which water systems typically plan. And so typically they'll look at their average day demand over an annual period to determine their annual source needs. And then they'll look at their maximum day demand to determine the pumping and storage capacity. And so the maximum day demand is typically 2 times your average day demand, or if data is available, the average of your 3 highest days. And so you can see where drought conditions, in drought conditions, demand may exceed your planned levels such that you're unable to meet the peak time of day demand. That might be morning or evening, or in many cases at midnight when everybody turns on their drinking or their irrigation system for their lawns. Or they may be able to unable to replenish storage during off-peak times. They may be unable to pump enough water from available resources, so we're assuming the water's there, due to infrastructure pumping limitations, or they may be unable to pump enough water from available sources due to limiting water rights. So as we move on here, we look at the mitigation measures and resiliency, and we look at them from 3 different areas. One is planning and design. So that would be your infrastructure capacity. Your sources, particularly, do you have multiple wells or interties, or are you a single well? And your water rights, your existing versus additional that might be available, or potentially if they're seasonal, and then potential for temporary water rights, assuming you have water available from some area in drought conditions. And policy and education is a huge in this case. Remembering we have 576 different public water systems out there. Are they considering water use efficiency? Do they have rate structures to address the dynamics of potential drought to where we encourage conservation and efficiency? Are there incentives? Do they have restrictions in place through policy where they may have a mandatory outdoor watering schedule, which you can see prominently displayed in Ferndale, for example, on their sandwich boards? Or maybe there's no outdoor watering in a drought contingency plan. And do they have the compliance in order to address that? And then it's really governing body and consumer awareness and education. And then when we move into management and operations, we're assuming we have some plan here. And so we need to be monitoring consistently and regularly so that the action plan we've set up, that we can implement that. And that may be things like reducing system pressure, which has actually been successful when we've got on the fence there to be able to reduce demand. Although you may see rings of unirrigated lawns as a result of that. Or you may pump from multiple sources at a lesser rate in order to address possibly a dropping water table. Let's see if I can get my slide to roll here. So here's a quick snapshot in Whatcom County when you think water rights. The dark green areas are generally perceived to be public water systems that may have a surplus water supply available to help out those that are in need of water, especially during a drought. Those light green areas are systems that believe they have adequate water rights for existing and planned future demand, but no surplus. The yellow are those systems that have enough water for existing demand, but not even enough to plan for future growth, and certainly no surplus. And then those big red targets there you see there, in any given year, whether during a drought, they may exceed their annual or their instantaneous water right. And so they certainly struggle much quicker than the rest when you talk about water shortages with regards to water rights. So here's another snapshot from the Coordinated Water System Plan, and I'm going to leave you with an important takeaway in a minute from this, but this is the interties, because it's a very popular subject, and so as potential mitigation measures. And the blue arrows are those where there's active interties, generally wholesale water to an adjacent utility, and the red arrows are those emergency interties that could come into play where there's agreement and possibly water rights in place. But the takeaway here is that these interties that you see, most, if not all of them, are decades old. They were established 30, 40, 50 years ago or longer in some cases. And so you can imagine, assuming you have navigated the water right challenges and you've navigated the agreement challenge between governing bodies, you still have to navigate the infrastructure that's required. And it may be only 30, 40, 50 feet or a road crossing, or it could be thousands of feet and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And those are things you just don't do quickly. And so as we kind of wrap up here, we look at what kind of actions we might take for mitigation and resiliency. And so certainly our takeaway is we have a wide range of system size, resources, and culture to deal with. The larger systems that serve most of the population generally are going to have some resources for drought contingency and planning and preparedness if they have the fortitude to do that. I think Linden's a great example with their off-channel storage project for mitigation. But on the other hand, we have those small systems that need assistance with drought contingency planning and preparedness because they lack awareness, they lack capacity, they lack resources. And not the least of their challenges is they lack volunteers, which is how most of these systems operate. And so in many cases, their governing body is people sitting around a kitchen table trying to figure out how to keep the lights on and the water flowing. And so, to conclude here, really what we need to do for all systems that can benefit from this drought planning and preparedness, we need to raise the public awareness for the community and for public water systems. We need to build resiliency in the water system planning process. Vulnerability assessment is something that's fairly easy for every system to do, and so we certainly need to do that so they're informed and can be proactive. We think of source monitoring. It's got to be done on an ongoing basis, and many times systems think they've got it handled, but they're only halfway to their planned build out. So while they have some resiliency built in today, I know of systems that in 10 or 15 years, when they're reaching their build out capacity, their extra storage or their extra pumping capacity is going to be consumed on a day-to-day basis. And so that resiliency declines. And then as they gather the information listed above here, they develop strategies for mitigation. What might those be? Or mitigation and resiliency related to source or their water rights, storage and pumping. And then response actions, obviously, as a drought condition approaches, we've set a plan forward so that we can look at that, and it varies greatly between short-term and long-term conservation there. So I guess kind of the two takeaways I have is think of a short-term drought and that most systems are resilient to that. You know, one of the questions that often comes up when we have these discussions is what were the impacts? And I love what Marti said, the impacts that hit hard. And so in the 2015 drought declaration, we really only had a small handful of small systems that I'm going to say were groundwater, or even go so far as to say they were groundwater under the influence of surface water, or very, very shallow wells. And they really didn't have a resiliency built in. And yet those are the only couple of examples I can think of, other than maybe a couple of the larger systems were a little concerned about their peaking demand when you get the longer warm periods. So that's something to consider. And then the other thing is, we really recognize that if we have an extended drought and the water table in Whatcom County drops, the Sumas and the Abbotsford aquifer, if they drop, it really changes the dynamic for all these small systems that have shallow single wells that don't have emergency interties or alternate sources. So I think that kind of paints the picture I wanted to present today for public water systems.
Excellent, thanks, Dave. So we have some questions coming through. Do many small systems have storage capacity to deal with drought conditions?
I'm going to say that 99% of small systems have no legitimate storage capacity. They might have a bladder tank that gives them, 30, 40 gallons to buffer their demand. But as a rule of thumb, no, most public water systems do not have any storage.
And another question, are there things that individuals or water systems can do to improve the capacity of shallow wells during drought conditions? And what does drought impact? And does drought impact the water quality of well water?
I'm going to answer the second one first, I think. I can tell you absolutely, as the water table is impacted, let's say it drops a little bit, that can certainly have it, but the traditional experience that most systems will see is that as they pump harder on their source, they will draw further into that aquifer. And so the cone of depression, as the water draws out of your well, that cone of depression expands. And so a simple example is one particular water system that I happen to be a customer of. They'll pump twice as hard in the summertime on the same aquifer because they'll use 2 wells instead of 1. And so the iron and manganese levels increase dramatically where customers know it. And so they always wrestle, do they want to treat for iron and manganese, but for 9 months out of the year, they don't notice it. So that's the water quality question. And I didn't remember the first question.
The first part of it was, are there things that individuals or water systems can do to improve the capacity of shallow wells during drought conditions?
Well, speaking frankly, it's probably not likely that they're going to spend tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars establishing storage. And in an extended drought condition, they're only going to be able to fill that with the water that's in the ground. And so while it might buy them hours or days for a short drought, which is why most water systems haven't had to struggle, really adding storage is going to be very difficult and a very limited solution. So other things that they can do, really when you're talking wells, in our experience, the best thing that we can do is drill to the bottom of the aquifer that you're in. A lot of times we'll stop short because of the type of well we're drilling or the expense. But I can tell you, if you're looking at your priority of your water rights and somebody else impacts you and you're a junior water right holder, very bluntly speaking, the response to you is, can you drill deeper? And if you can, do it. Thank you very much. We wish you the best of luck. I'm trying to be straight up as I can there. And that's been the case in Whatcom County where you've had impacts. So go as deep as you can within your aquifer to get your water, and then multiple sources, whether that's multiple wells so you can pump on them less hard, but more of them. Those are the two key takeaways, I think.
Great, thanks. What is the responsibility of the community at large to deal with people who have located where the water availability is low?
I'm gonna have to have you read that again, see if I can figure out the answer to that.
Sure, and to paraphrase, I think it might be referring to some of the water systems that you had on your map that are in the red right now, or maybe the ones in the yellow, and essentially what is the responsibility of the community to try to help those water systems that might be struggling?
Well, I guess what I'm going to do is punt the question in case it comes up later, so you can introduce your next speaker, because that's a really tough question and I'd be happy to answer it, but it couldn't do it in the time we have here.
Got it. Yeah, and there was another one from Jeff Marti, but maybe you can respond offline.
Sure.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for your informative presentation. And now we will move on to self-supplied residential water systems, also known more commonly as private wells. So we will hear from Jay Chennault. And Jay is a hydrogeologist and surface water engineer with 20 years of experience in watershed hydrology, surface water and groundwater interactions, numerical groundwater modeling, production well installation and testing, seawater intrusion analyses, wellhead protection area delineation, and field data collection. Jay has been consulting in the Puget Sound area for the last 16 years, where he has applied his skills to regional watershed projects, water right and water availability operations, or evaluations, excuse me, water supply projects, residential well mitigation projects, and sand and gravel mining operations. Prior to his consulting career, Jay was with the Water Resources Division with the USGS, working primarily on stream gauging sites in Snohomish, Skagit, and Whatcom counties. So now I will turn it over to you, Jay. You might be on mute.
Unmute.
There we go.
I think I unmuted, and I'm trying to get my video up.
I can turn that on for you.
Great.
There you go.
So hopefully everybody can see the first slide of my presentation. So yes, good afternoon. My name is Jay Chennault. I'm a senior associate hydrogeologist with Associated Earth Sciences in Mount Vernon, and here to talk about self-supplied residential water systems. Most of these self-supplied water systems are permit exempt wells that are using groundwater to supply individual homes. So let's see, how do I, there. Okay, so first I thought it'd be a good idea to talk a little bit about the hydrogeology of Western Whatcom County, which includes 4 primary regional aquifers. A vast majority of all water supply wells are completed in the Sumas aquifer. It's been talked about a few times today already. So the Sumas aquifer is a shallow, unconfined aquifer that occupies this light purple area of Western Whatcom County, essentially spans the entire Nooksack River Valley and the Sumas River Valley. There's also a limited unconfined aquifer called the Sumas Everson aquifer, shown in light green, that's present beneath the upland areas west of Ferndale and also east of Blaine. And then there's 2 deeper aquifers present throughout western Whatcom County. So as part of our work with the development of a numerical groundwater model for the study area shown on the slide, is we compiled a database of water supply wells with water well reports throughout the county. That database now includes about 1,000 wells, which seems like a lot until you realize that there are probably 10 or 15,000 permit exempt wells that exist countywide. But in our database, we have about 65% of the wells are completed in the Sumas aquifer, with fewer wells completed in those other units. And I expect if we could fully document all the permanent exempt wells that exist in the county, upwards of 90% of all the wells will be completed in that Sumas aquifer. So here's a subsurface hydrogeologic cross-section of the same study area. Going north is to the left, south is to the right, going from Canada through the Nooksack Valley and into the kind of Deer Creek area. So you can see the Sumas aquifer is present, throughout the valley. It's relatively shallow and thin, and the deeper aquifer units include the Vashon Olympia aquifer, present through much of western Whatcom County, and then a deeper possession with the aquifer that we interpret to be present throughout most of the area as well. But again, most permit exempt wells are completed in the Sumas aquifer. I think the only reason they wouldn't be is if you're in areas outside of the valley where the Sumas aquifer is not present. You'd be forced to drill into the Vashon Olympia aquifer. But there's really no permit exempt wells that I know of that are drilling into the deepest position with the aquifer. So, as we discussed before, the Sumas aquifer is shallow, relatively permeable, and it gets its seasonal groundwater recharge quite quickly. And so, year to year fluctuations and seasonal fluctuations in groundwater levels are common. Groundwater recharge to those deeper aquifers is limited by the low permeability sediments that separate those aquifers. So it takes longer for groundwater recharge to reach those units. So speaking of permit exempt wells, so the primary source for all self-supplied water users in the county, the state groundwater code exempts from the groundwater permitting process groundwater use when it is below the limits that are shown on the slide here. So indoor domestic use is allowed up to 5,000 gallons per day. In addition to that, there's a commercial or industrial exemption up to 5,000 gallons per day if you're using that water to produce a product that you sell. Irrigation of a lawn or garden up to a half an acre is also exempt, and then all stock watering is also exempt. Now recently, the Nooksack in-stream flow rule was amended, and it places further restrictions on the limits that are exempt from the groundwater code. So for new wells and new building permits after June 27th, 2020, indoor domestic use is now limited to 500 gallons per day, and outdoor use is limited to irrigation of a lawn or non-commercial garden up to 1/12 of an acre. A group of homes together would be limited to 3,000 gallons per day for the entire group and 500 gallons per day per connection, and again, 1/12 of an acre per connection. During a drought, there is a trigger in the new rule where there's no change to indoor domestic use, but outdoor irrigation, it would be limited to maintaining subsistence gardening only. So kind of an estimate of existing permit exempt use in the county. So back in 2010, the Lower Nooksack water budget estimated that there was about 23,000 people, and a little over 9,000 homes in the lower Nooksack Basin area that were self-supplied. And based on kind of growth patterns since that time of about 120 or so homes per year, in the lower Nooksack area, you're looking at probably 27,000 people that are on 11,000 different permanent exempt water systems. And then if you expand that county-wide, you're on the order of 40,000 people, and that 16,000 self-supplied water systems that Sue mentioned earlier. In the future, ecology is estimated, kind of on that same order of growth, but over the next 20 years, about 2,000 additional homes will be built in WWIN over the next 20 years. So it may not, it adds up, all of these different homes. So in the future, we're looking at probably on the order of 50,000 people throughout the county that are using permanent exempt or individual self-supplied water systems for their only source of water. I guess it's important to kind of quantify, what that water use looks like. There's been lots of studies, especially recently, about indoor water use on permit exempt wells. The consensus is becoming about 150 gallons per day is typical for indoor water use. Outdoor water use obviously varies quite a bit based on how much outdoor irrigation and stock watering a certain house might be doing. But on the order of 250 to 500 gallons per day in addition to that indoor water use is probably pretty typical in the summertime for these rural homes. So because of the volumes of water that each house uses, I think a lot of people assume that they're not very vulnerable to droughts. And that could be the case many times, but there's certainly vulnerabilities for these self-supplied water users. So as has been talked about, droughts can lower regional aquifer levels due to decreased seasonal or long-term trends in groundwater recharge. And then you couple that with increased water use during the droughts, and water levels in these aquifers can lower, which can be cause some vulnerabilities for these permanent exempt wells. Particularly the well construction on a single family well, they typically have shallow completions. Well drillers are paid by the foot, and so typically they don't drill wells any deeper than they have to get adequate water supplies. It's rare, as Dave mentioned, that these wells are completed initially to the full extent and depth of the aquifer. So they can be completed very shallowly. And then they're typically not installed with efficiency in mind, and so they're probably, the pumping drawdown is greater than it might need to be if they were constructed with more efficiency in mind, and this is particularly true for older systems. And as Dave mentioned too, even for some of the smaller public water systems, storage is little to none. Most single-family homes have a pressure tank is all, so it essentially becomes on-demand pumping of the well when it's needed. And then, maintenance and monitoring, typical single-family exempt wells, have none of that taking place. So a homeowner doesn't really have any idea how vulnerable they might be, because they don't know how the well is performing. So to mitigate or create some resiliency for some of these vulnerabilities, I guess number one, I would say it's important to know your water level. So both static, so your non-pumping water level can give you an idea of what the aquifer conditions are like, and the long-term trends in the water level in your well can be an indicator of potential problems in the future. And then documenting your pumping water level is important too, because it would help you identify if you've got declines in your well efficiency that might create problems when water demands are the highest. in addition to your water level, it's important to know your well. So how deep it is, where it's screened, where the pump is set, and what the pumping rate is. Without this information, it's really hard to kind of troubleshoot problems, as they arise from a potential drought in the future. So some water system improvements that you can consider, you can increase storage. You can install a small, several thousand gallon water tank might help offset, the pumping demand during some of those droughts. Deeper well, as Dave mentioned, could help individual system as well. And then decreasing your water use through efficiency would obviously help as well. And then, truck water in an emergency situation can work if you've got some storage to put it. And then, rainwater catchment to offset, particular exterior outdoor water use or even indoor water use can reduce the demand that you need from groundwater during a drought. So that is about it. So I'm happy to answer questions if you have them.
Yes, and we do have a few questions. So I'll go to the first question that came up before your presentation, and that's, do we know the status of our aquifers? Are they drawing down over time? Does the surface aquifer recharge each year?
Yeah, so Andy touched on the Sumas aquifer, and I'll agree with what he said. The Sumas aquifer does have seasonal declines in water use, but it generally fills up every winter. The aquifer is essentially topped off by winter recharge every year, so there's really no long-term declines to be concerned about there, in my view. And even with climate change, I think there's some projections to suggest that groundwater recharge in the Sumas aquifer will likely increase due to increased precipitation during the winter months. The deeper aquifers, across the state are always a concern on monitoring for long-term declines. And I know, regional water suppliers that are using water from those deeper aquifers are monitoring those water levels for trends.
Great. What is the level of understanding of where the water in the aquifers comes from, i.e. from the Fraser, the Nooksack, local streams, or precipitation?
Right, so yeah, it all comes from precipitation originally and through groundwater recharge. So that's how all these aquifers are replenished over time. So the Sumas aquifer does extend up into Canada and up into kind of the Fraser Basin. There is a groundwater divide, so we're not really getting any groundwater recharge through kind of the Fraser River surface water system into the Sumas aquifer. It's all about precipitation that falls on the ground surface above those aquifers.
Great. Well, thank you, Jay. I know there's another question, 2 more questions that came in through the chat, but I think we might have time at the end, maybe for some general questions. So if you wouldn't mind sticking around, that would be much appreciated. In the meantime, we will move on to our next speaker, who is Henry Bierlink, who will speak to agriculture. Henry Bierlink is a Linden native. He operated a Linden dairy farm for several years, earned an MA in political science from Western Washington University, and has over 30 years of engagement in agriculture and public policy. Henry currently serves as the administrator of the Ag Water Board, a facilitating entity for 6 watershed improvement districts, also known as WIDs, or irrigation districts, located in Whatcom County. He also serves as the executive director of the Washington Red Raspberry Commission and the Washington Seed Potato Commission. So Henry, it's all yours.
Thank you, Carly. Sound good?
Yes.
Good, and thank you to the planning team, and also to all the fellow presenters, and especially to those who are listening wanting to learn about water. That's pretty important, and it's great. I want to just talk a little bit about let's make sure I can get down here. There we went. There it is. I want to give the context for this. I was asked to speak about the ag side of it. I want to talk a little about what ag is, make sure everybody understands that in Whatcom County. And then I think it's fair to say that we have water issues that we've been working on for a long time, and the drought issues just accentuate the issues that already exist. So some of this is going to cover just broader water issues, and some of it will cover just the accentuated issues related to drought. So with this map, you see that the green section is the ag zone in Whatcom County, and the little red boxes within the browner zones, those are the rural areas. Those are target areas for us to protect more agricultural land. The context here is that we need to keep a critical mass of agricultural land here to preserve the future of agriculture. The county has designated 100,000 acres of that goal. 87 is already protected in the ag zone in some fashion, and we're working on finding ways to do a little better job of protecting the ag area in the rural area as well. And water is one of the biggest questions about the future of agriculture. What agriculture is in this county is predominantly this is based on the value of production. So dairy is a little over half of the value of production in this county. Was the largest by far. It's been coming down somewhat, and fruit and nuts and berries have been growing. And our ag value still remains about as high as it's ever been. The only thing I have with kind of fault with this thing is seed potato is not showing any numbers here. This ag stats don't collect that very easily, and seed potato would be another one of the bigger areas in agriculture in Whatcom County. So what is the drought effects? Certainly some of them are just they're physical things, like when we have more sunshine and less rain, we are going to have more use of water. And that also, not only will the plants use more water, but they're also going to stress out the systems that we have for irrigation. Most of the systems were not designed for high volume, high needs. So when we have had problems, they haven't been so much for the lack of water as our systems are not designed adequately to be able to put as much water on for that long a period. And then we kind of get into the more legal side of things, which is inadequate water rights, subject to minimum in-stream flows, the competition with that, and then look into the future about how are we going to adapt to lowering summer flows particularly in the Nooksack River, and then a potential gradual depletion of the aquifer. But as was mentioned earlier, we really haven't seen that. And I don't believe we really will with the rainfalls that we get in the winter. We always replenish the aquifer that we've been using. So what have we done on these particular issues to challenge that? We're looking for better information on water rights and what areas are irrigated and what crops. We are using more and more irrigation and water management plans that make sure that we are irrigating as efficiently as possible. We're replacing surface water diversions with groundwater withdrawals, taking stress away from the surface water flows, which tend to be our biggest challenge because we're competing with fish and other things in surface water, but groundwater really is pretty abundant. And as I've mentioned, it replenishes each year. We seasonally draw it down, but we always replenish it thanks to our rainfall patterns here. And the fact that we have as much recharge ability in agricultural land. It's not paved over. It replenishes those aquifers very well. Other things we can do, schedule irrigation, look at water storage capacity. We can find ways to do that. Look at new sources of water, especially deep aquifers seem to be one of the most promising ways to do that. And then really work within ideas like the Water Rights Bank and exchange program that reduce the hurdles of water law, which really do stand in the way for us in a lot of ways of managing water wisely and efficiently. Things underneath that would be facilitating seasonal transfers, where high crops could purchase water from lower value crops, move that water around, And then ensuring that irrigation is available to all crops. And this goes back to my earliest point. If we really desire agriculture in Whatcom County and keep that critical mass available, then all the land zoned for farming needs the ability to access irrigation so it can be successful. That is really what we build our water program around. A little bit just on water. This is how much, just to give you perspective of how agriculture is a huge water user. This is what the crop demand is for agriculture in the summer. You'll notice the average annual public water demand is pretty low. That's just the seasonal drinking water, or for the year. That's over the year average. It goes up obviously in the summer. But our demand, this is showing the total crop demand for water, and there are three sources though. We get soil moisture, that we use some of the water from the soil moisture drawing up from the aquifer, the plants itself. Precipitation is obviously another one, and then irrigation, the third. And irrigation, some years, like this year, where we've had a fair amount of irrigation or precipitation throughout the year, is not nearly a high a percentage as it normally be. But in a drought year, irrigation will be very much a big part of this whole puzzle of the water demand. See that dairy is in the red, berries in the blue, and other crops, including seed potatoes, probably the biggest one in the other. So what have we done to try to organize on this is we've organized these watershed improvement districts. These are the ones that exist here in the county. There are 6 of them. These are irrigation districts organized under state law by the farmers who voted to assess themselves per acre to try to work on these particular issues, knowing that we have to band together to be able to reach all these type of goals. The Ag Water Board coordinates all 6 of those districts. And this, as I mentioned, they're irrigation districts. We've been working on several different things that have helped to make this work. It's particularly moving a lot of surface water diversions to groundwater. It's been one of the major projects. We have a flow influence augmentation project that we've tried over the years, and we could do more places. We've shown that that has actually increased the flow in the streams. And then we are big advocates of drainage-based management, which we are starting in 3 different pilot drainages. The county is coordinating this. There we recognize that water management must incorporate all the different factors that affect it: habitat, water access, drainage, flood management, water quality, and also land use. This is, those are some of the issues that we've been working on. This is just some shots from the past. This is the augmentation project we were working on. You'll see some characters that you know, and also habitat. And I can answer questions from there.
Great, that was a speedy presentation. So far, we haven't had any questions come in through the chat, but I'll give it a couple seconds to see if anybody has any.
Could certainly go back to Jay. Jay had a few questions to go back. That's no problem. I can hold off and answer any more questions in the later part as well.
Okay. Here's one. So, what are you learning with the water augmentation project?
What we learned is that we had to learn that we actually put 1 CFS of water into a stream that was at about 3 or 4 CFS. So we made a significant contribution. This was on Bertrand Creek, and in August, September, a couple years back. We had to learn a lot about, and you'll see the little picture there is our little diversion. We had to be able to make sure we put enough oxygen in that water coming out of the groundwater. Didn't have oxygen. They wanted to oxygenate it, get it into the stream, and we measured at least 1 more CFS downstream for a significant period of time. We believe we can do this in a lot of different places if we need to, and it worked pretty well. It's artificial, certainly that, but there's really not many other ways we're going to be able to make those streams have enough flow that would be able to be optimal habitat for the fish. So this is one of the tools that we are willing to use in the right places. then that has to then be designated in this drainage-based management process. Where do we need to do this, and how we need to do, when do we need to do this, and how is that going to help both the fish and farmers survive into the future?
What are the hurdles to converting surface to groundwater rights?
There are some that are fairly easy, others are really pretty difficult. And most of it's not physical problems. We can do this. The problems are in state water law, allowing the incentive to be able to do that, and how you can do it and when you can do it. Foster decision, that means something to some people, but it's very difficult for us to be able to do this in many different cases. In fact, Ecology gave us a grant to work on some of these projects, had to actually stop that grant project, due to the fact that the foster case would not allow them to do some of these kind of things. So our hurdles are usually in water law rather than in the physical factors.
And what are you doing with drainage-based management specifically? Like, are there particular projects or other types of work that are happening under drainage-based management?
It is building on, it's in the Watershed Management Board's 5-year work plan. It's starting, it's kind of piggybacking on the Regional Water Supply Plan, which PUD is now coordinating. And we're really getting that going in a real meaningful way right now. And the drainage-based management is sort of the next iteration of that. We've got 3 pilot areas designated. We've met several different times with the leading groups within those different drainages. And we're hoping to build that into something a lot more effective into the future.
Thank you, Henry. I think we are going to be moving on now to our next speaker here. Hopefully my screen is working. Let's try this again. Dick Whitmore is a retired forestry engineer practicing, and he's been practicing forestry for over 50 years. He's worn many hats as foresters do. His first 7 years was with the U.S. Forest Service, with the last 2 of which were as a timber sale administrator at the Glacier Ranger Station. For over a decade, Dick was the manager of a local large logging company and built a road building company. He also managed a plywood mill and a sawmill. Other endeavors of his include forestry consultant and raw material manager. The last 15 years have been spent as a watershed rehabilitation consultant in Central America. So with that, Dick, I will let you have the floor. And I will.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, and thanks for all the work everybody has done to put this on. It's a great opportunity to give a lot of information out. Before I start, I just want to let people know that these Zoom meetings, they got a lot of downfalls on them, but a couple of the things I think are positive is I didn't have to shave this morning and I didn't have to dress up. So there are some positives to all this. Before I start, also, I am sight limited, so sometimes when I'm reading something, I lose my place, so please be patient. Now I'll try to do the best I can. As most of you already know, 90+% of the water in the lower stem of the Nooksack River comes from the Cascade Mountains west of Mount Baker, Mount Shruxon, Twin Sisters, and Bear Mountain. Because of the glaciers, snowpack, and heavy rains in the past, this served our county well. With the great migration of people and the intensified use of our land, enough water for all uses has become problematic. In today's world of possible drought and the ever-changing climate, we are faced with preparing ourselves for being able to adapt to these changes. The forest lands and their majestic mountain neighbors with massive glaciers are an intricate part of keeping a sufficient flow of water in our rivers. With the possibility of the change to warmer weather, we need to understand how we are going to adapt these lands to fulfill our desires downstream. To more closely understand the complexity of forest adaptability, we have to look at the ownership of this land. The largest landowner with the most important part of the watershed is the U.S. Forest Service. These lands are the headwaters of all the forks of the Nooksack River system and contain all of the contributing glaciers. These are the primary lands for providing water resilience in Whatcom County. The lands managed by the Department of Natural Resources are commingled with the private commercial timberlands. All these lands are in the foothills of the Cascades. To understand the ability for the land managers to adapt to change, I have created an adaptability/resilience chart with a score of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest score. Briefly, the score is based on how fast can the managers react to climate changes, how well maintained is the transportation system, the ability and number of professional staff, level of political interference, available budgets for reaching to change, for reacting to change, creative outside of the box solution solving, and the multiple use ethic. A score came out this way: Department of Natural Resources 5.5, private industry 7, and the U.S. Forest Service 1. The most important lands to all of Whatcom County failed miserably. Why? The Forest Service has not been able to do much of any kind of meaningful management for decades, with no money and very few qualified personnel in the workforce with the ability to manage land. Forest roads have deteriorated, young stands of timber have been left to stagnate, diverse wildlife habitat has dwindled, watershed function has been degraded. The forest has probably become a carbon emitter instead of a carbon sequester, especially in the hemlock zone, where over 50% of the trees are dead, down, dying, decaying, and or diseased. A classic example of Forest Service not being able to adapt is the recent project the Baker Ranger District is proposing in the North Fork area. This project is to increase wildlife habitat and watershed function, a very admirable project, and has happened in the past. As has happened in the past, the urban elitist preservation groups have put an all-out attack on this plan, just as they have in the past. This has just led to analysis paralysis, and nothing gets done. Because the Forest Service lands are so crucial to water resiliency in our county, without these lands becoming adaptable to a drought situation, the rest of the county will be in dire straits for water no matter what we try to do downstream. In all my work in watershed rehabilitation, my first look is upstream. If we do not manage the infiltration of water in our forests and create water storage in the upper reaches, we are going to fail the resiliency test and run very low on water. On Department of Natural Resource trust land, the trend to not manage their lands in multiple use ethic has caused them to set aside approximately 50% of their lands into non-managed lands, leaving them more vulnerable to drought and related destruction. If the DNR follows the same rate of land taken out of active management in 20 years, there will be they'd be as impotent as the Forest Service in managing the lands for any resource. The DNR has diminished its timber sales so much in the past few years that they do not have the money to perform simple silvicultural practices that are needed to keep forests healthy and growing properly. This growing lack of performing silvicultural practices will create much larger problems in a drought situation. Private timberlands are in a better management situation to be adaptive in a drought situation. First, the political bureaucracy is not as pervasive. Most of the private lands in Whatcom County are owned by companies that believe in sustainability and are here for the long haul. Private companies can change their management practices in a short period of time to meet the conditions on the ground, much faster than government agencies. Private landowner transportation systems are maintained at a higher level than other land managers, so managing these lands is much more efficient. An example of quick response is when the private industry and the State Department of Natural Resources went through the process called road maintenance and abandonment plans. In about 15 years, roads have been brought up to a standard that meets clean water requirements and have removed all or replaced all fish barrier culverts. No other entity has done this, especially with their own money. This process shows the resilience and adaptability of the forest sector. The ever-growing urban population in this county and their push up into the forest to live is creating a whole new set of problems, especially in a drought situation. With homes not practicing fire safety, the forest lands are vulnerable to more fires. In the past few years of forest fires, the firefighters have had to spend an inordinate amount of time removing woody material from around houses and then defending them from fire. This has taken the few firefighters we have off the fire lines. In the last 30 years, the number of qualified firefighters has been cut in more than half because of the shutdown of the national forest and corresponding timber industry infrastructure. If roads are closed to traffic and a fire occurs at the end of a road, the scenario has happened many times. It may take hours, if not days, to get to the fire. By this time, the fire has gone from a small fire to a large project fire. If climate change does get warmer, the change will be slow enough for the timber industry to adapt. The biggest change that is seen is the Douglas fir zone rising in elevation and the hemlock zone giving way to the Douglas fir. In lower Douglas fir zones, the seeds used for reforestation may have to come from a drier area where the trees are more drought resistant. Fire reduction through thinning will help reduce the spread of fire and increase the infiltration of water into the ground. A shift in the attitudes of urban dwellers is important. They must understand that wood and paper they use does not come from a store, but must be grown. The forests are not there just for their enjoyment. These forests should be a mosaic of multiple uses. It is time to put down the swords and work together. As we have seen in the past 20 years of WIRA planning and work, we are not getting too far because we are not working together. We don't even have a vision of what the watershed should look like in 20 to 50 years. Let's do better with a drought plan. Why don't we take a big step and be realistic? If all the climate models are right, we are going to run out of natural storage in the mountains, snowpack glaciers. How will we put water into the river system for all the needs? Think water storage now instead of later. We in the timber industry are willing to help with this, but I know this is hard for some. We all need to look outside of our boxes. Proper science-based forest management is more important for all of us now than ever before. Open minds, honesty, and trust must be established. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Dick. And we have a couple minutes for questions, if anybody has any that they'd like to ask. While we're waiting, I will mention that there is a survey that folks can fill out for the afternoon session. This is different than the one that we shared over the morning. And if you participate in it, please enter your name. That way we can enter you into a drawing. Of course, you can keep your survey anonymous if you feel that way as well. And Cheryl just posted that in the chat. I know it's the end of the day, so a lot of people are probably feeling a little, a little tired, but I think I might circle back to maybe some of our other questions to see if our previous presenters could answer them. So one of the questions that we had received, I think during Jay's presentation, was what is the level of information on the contributions of aquifers to in-stream flows in the Nooksack and in the lowland tributaries? So Jay, I don't know if you're still with us, if you could answer that.
I am still with us.
Great.
It's a good question, and it's complicated, of course, and varies by region. But we do know that the Sumas aquifer is in direct hydraulic communication with both the Nooksack and the lowland tributaries to the Nooksack. So, so that communication helps the Sumas aquifer maintain base flows in the streams during low flow periods, and the surface to groundwater conversions that Henry was talking about, and the stream flow augmentation project utilize that knowledge, because we know that there's a lag time in that delay of when groundwater is reaching the stream. And so we can pump out of groundwater far from the stream and then discharge it directly to the river or the creek. And knowing that that lag time exists, where that groundwater impact eventually migrates its way to that tributary, we can time it in such a way to get the benefit, but then precipitation recharge in that shallow Sumas aquifer. Essentially, when the rains start, it wipes out that deficit that we've created from groundwater pumping to so that impact never migrates its way to the stream. So you get the benefit without the impact. And that all comes from our understanding of how that surface water and groundwater interact. The deeper aquifers, much more complicated, but in the Sumas, I think there's generally a good understanding of how the surface water and groundwater systems are interacting with each other.
All right, there is a question for you, Dick, that just came in. Does the forest sector have an estimate of the quantity of managed forest land to ensure sustainable viability?
That's a great question, Helen. That's one we're trying to get answered right now. Is we're looking at, since our industry's been shrinking, we've lost a lot of the infrastructure. What makes a viable timber industry in Whatcom County? And you know, just like the agriculture community, we need to know, we need to have a number of, you know, where we are, because we are close to collapse in this county. Look around, there's no pulp mills, one sawmill, no cedar mills, no hardwood mills in this area whatsoever. You got a woodland owner has to go a long ways to take his wood to a mill.
Great, thank you, Dick. And with that, I think we're just about wrapped up. It's 2:57 in the afternoon. So I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us this afternoon, our presenters and all of you participants who stuck around. And then I want to also, again, recognize our event sponsors. So thank you so much, everybody, and for making this a successful event. Again, we will have this recorded and posted on the Whatcom Watersheds Information Network website, which is WWIN.org, sometime in the coming days. So stay tuned for that. And please, please do fill out the survey, because that's valuable information on how WIN and the Whatcom MRC can improve the speaker series. So please let us know if there are any questions, and we will see you off and have a great afternoon.